Hey guys, and welcome back. Tonight, we begin our journey in a time of great pageantry and even greater paranoia, Tudor England. We'll be exploring what life was like when justice was less about evidence and more about public spectacle. So, before you get truly comfortable, take just a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. For lesser crimes, punishment was all about public shame. You might find yourself locked in the stocks or the pillory in the center of the market square. Your head and hands are trapped, making you a helpless target for the town's scorn. George Eastman was born in 1854 in upstate New York. His early life was marked by hardship. His father died when he was young, leaving the family in financial difficulty. Eastman had to drop out of school at age 14 to work as an office boy to help support his mother and sisters. This early experience instilled in him a fierce work ethic and a determination to escape poverty. He became a bank clerk, a steady and respectable job, but his mind was restless and inventive. In his 20s, he became fascinated by the emerging technology of photography. But he was frustrated by how incredibly complicated and cumbersome it was. In the 1870s, photography was a serious undertaking. It involved the wet plate process, where a photographer had to carry around what was essentially a portable darkroom. This included a bulky wooden camera the size of a microwave oven, a heavy tripod, glass plates, and a host of volatile chemicals. To take a single picture, the photographer had to coat a glass plate with a light-sensitive chemical mixture, expose it while it was still wet, and then develop it immediately on the spot. It was an expensive, messy, and highly technical process, strictly the domain of dedicated professionals and wealthy hobbyists. Eastman was convinced there had to be a better way. Working out of his mother's kitchen at night after his long days at the bank, Eastman began to experiment. His goal was to create a, quote, dry plate formula. This would mean the glass plates could be prepared in advance and developed later, freeing the photographer from the need to carry a portable laboratory. After years of tireless experimentation, reading chemistry journals and mixing concoctions in his sink, he succeeded. He not only perfected a reliable dry plate formula, but also invented a machine to mass produce them. In 1880, he quit his safe banking job and went into the photography business full-time, founding the Eastman Dry Plate Company. The dry plates were a huge success and made photography significantly more convenient for professionals. But Eastman's ambition was much grander. He didn't just want to improve photography for the existing market. He wanted to create an entirely new market. He envisioned a world where anyone, regardless of technical skill, could take pictures. The key to this vision was to move away from heavy, fragile glass plates altogether. His next great innovation was the development of a flexible film base, a roll of paper coated with the same light-sensitive emulsion. This was the breakthrough that would make the modern camera possible. In 1888, Eastman introduced a product that would revolutionize the world: the Kodak camera. The name Kodak was a pure invention, a word Eastman created himself. He wanted a name that was short, easy to pronounce and remember, and that couldn't be mispronounced or associated with anything else. The camera itself was a simple, small, lightweight wooden box, preloaded with a roll of film capable of taking 100 pictures. It had a fixed focus lens and a single shutter speed. There were no adjustments to be made. It was the ultimate point-and-shoot camera, decades ahead of its time. The true genius of the Kodak system was not just the camera, but the business model that came with it. This was perfectly encapsulated in the company's brilliant and enduring slogan, "You press the button, we do the rest." An ordinary person would buy the Kodak camera for $25, a significant but not impossible sum at the time. They would take their 100 pictures. Then they would mail the entire camera back to the factory in Rochester, New York. There, the film would be developed, the prints would be made, and the camera would be reloaded with a fresh roll of film and sent back to the customer, all for a fee of $10. This system was revolutionary. It completely separated the act of taking a picture from the complex chemical process of developing it. For the first time, people could participate in photography without needing any technical knowledge whatsoever. Eastman had democratized the image. He was not just selling a camera. He was selling a service. He was selling memories. This business model, which we might today call a subscription or ecosystem model, ensured a continuous stream of revenue for the company and made customers for life. The money wasn't just in the initial sale of the camera, but in the ongoing process of developing and printing. The Kodak camera was a sensation. It created a new kind of picture, the snapshot. Before Kodak, photographs were formal, stiffly posed portraits taken in a studio. The subjects were always aware they were being photographed. The snapshot was different. It was casual, informal, and spontaneous. People could now take pictures of their families on vacation, their children playing in the yard, a day at the beach. It captured life as it was lived, not as it was posed. This created a new visual language and fundamentally changed our relationship with our own personal history. The family album, filled with candid moments, was born. George Eastman was a brilliant marketer who understood the emotional power of photography. His advertisements rarely focused on the technical specifications of his products. Instead, they sold an ideal, a lifestyle. His ads featured the Kodak girl, an elegant, independent woman traveling the world with her camera, capturing her adventures. This was a clever way to associate the product with modernity, freedom, and fun. He was selling the idea that photography was not a chore, but a delightful and essential part of a full and happy life. He made owning a camera not just a hobby, but a social necessity. Eastman was also a relentless innovator, constantly pushing his company to improve its products. He knew that the paper-based film was not ideal, as the grain of the paper could show up in the final print. He invested heavily in research and development, and in 1889, his company introduced the first transparent, flexible celluloid film. This new film base, sold in rolls, was a massive leap forward in quality and became the standard for the entire industry. It was this invention that also made motion pictures possible, as it provided the long, continuous strip of film that early filmmakers like Thomas Edison needed for their new motion picture cameras. This wasn't just punishment, it was entertainment. Crowds would gather to hurl not just insults, but rotten fruit, mud, and animal filth. It was a messy, smelly, and profoundly humiliating affair, designed to reinforce the social order through shared disgust. As his company grew into a global behemoth, Eastman became an incredibly wealthy man. But he was also a remarkably progressive and philanthropic figure. He was one of the first industrialists to introduce profit sharing for his employees, believing that the workers who contributed to the company's success should share in its rewards. He also donated vast sums of his personal fortune, over $100 million in his lifetime, equivalent to billions today, to educational and cultural institutions, including the founding of the Eastman School of Music and large endowments to MIT and the University of Rochester. He was a pioneer of corporate social responsibility long before the term existed. However, Eastman's life was also marked by a deep sense of personal isolation. He never married and had few close friends. He was a driven, work-obsessed man who found it difficult to form intimate relationships. His life was his company. As he grew older, he suffered from a progressive and painful spinal disorder that made walking difficult and confined him to a wheelchair. He had watched his mother suffer a similar fate, and he was terrified of becoming incapacitated and dependent on others. A man who had built his life on control and self-reliance could not bear the thought of losing it. In 1932, at the age of 77, George Eastman decided to end his life on his own terms. He hosted a final dinner party for his friends at his magnificent Rochester mansion. After they left, he calmly went to his room and wrote a short, simple note. It read, "To my friends, my work is done. Why wait?" He then died by a self-inflicted gunshot to the heart. It was a final, pragmatic act from a man who had meticulously planned every aspect of his life and business. He had transformed the world, put a camera in every home, and decided, with quiet finality, that his story was complete. The legacy of George Eastman and Kodak is immeasurable. He not only founded a company, but created an industry and a culture. He turned the act of remembering into a product that could be bought and sold, democratizing personal history for millions. The click of the shutter, the snapshot, the family album, these are all part of the world that Eastman built. While the Kodak company itself struggled to adapt to the digital revolution, it had ironically helped to pioneer. The fundamental idea that Eastman championed, that ordinary people should have the power to capture their own lives, is more relevant today than ever in our age of smartphones and social media. His work, in that sense, is truly never done. Let us now leave the world of industry and invention and journey back in time and across an ocean to the windswept, mysterious landscape of ancient Britain. We are going to a time before the Romans, before written history, to explore one of the most iconic and enigmatic monuments on Earth, Stonehenge. For thousands of years, these massive standing stones on the Salisbury Plain have captured the human imagination. Who built it? How did they build it? And why? The story of Stonehenge is a detective story written in stone, a testament to the incredible ingenuity, dedication, and spiritual ambition of a prehistoric people. Stonehenge was not built in a single event, but was constructed in several distinct phases over a period of at least 500 years. The earliest construction, dating back to around 3000 BC, was a large circular earthwork, a ditch and a bank, known as a henge. Inside this circle, 56 pits were dug, which are now known as the Aubrey holes, named after the 17th-century antiquarian who discovered them. It's believed these holes may have held timber posts, or perhaps even the first standing stones. This initial phase already marked the site as a special, sacred place set apart from the everyday world. The first stones to arrive at the site, around 2500 BC, were the smaller bluestones. These are remarkable for one key reason: they are not local. Geological analysis has proven that these stones, some weighing up to 4 tons, were quarried in the Preseli Hills in western Wales, over 150 miles away from the Salisbury Plain. The transportation of these massive stones over such a vast distance is one of the greatest feats of prehistoric engineering. It would have required an immense, coordinated effort, likely involving dragging the stones on sledges over land and loading them onto rafts to navigate rivers and coastal waters. The question of why these specific stones were chosen and transported at such great effort is one of Stonehenge's most enduring mysteries. Some archaeologists believe the Preseli Hills were considered a place of magical or healing properties, and that the stones were thought to possess a sacred power that was being brought to the ceremonial landscape of Salisbury. The sheer difficulty of the task suggests that the origin of the stones was as important as the stones themselves. This was a pilgrimage of stone, a monumental effort that would have required the cooperation of many different tribes or communities over a long period of time. The most famous and visually striking phase of construction occurred around the same time, around 2500 BC, with the arrival of the massive sarsen stones. These are a type of local sandstone quarried from the Marlborough Downs, about 20 miles to the north of Stonehenge. These are the truly giant stones of the monument. The largest of them weigh over 40 tons and stand up to 30 feet high. These were used to create the iconic outer circle of upright stones, capped with horizontal lintels, and the inner, U-shaped trilithon horseshoe, 5 sets of 2 uprights topped with a lintel. The shaping and erection of the sarsen stones reveal an astonishing level of sophistication. The builders were not simply placing rough boulders. They carefully shaped the stones using stone mauls to pound them into rectangular forms. They also created surprisingly complex woodworking joints to hold the structure together. The uprights have protruding tenons, bumps carved into their tops, which fit neatly into mortise holes, hollows carved into the underside of the lintel stones. The lintels of the outer circle were also joined to each other using a tongue-and-groove system. This was carpentry in stone, designed to ensure the structure was stable and locked together. More serious still were crimes against the state or God, which in Tudor England were often seen as the same thing. Heresy and treason were the ultimate transgressions, and they carried the ultimate penalties, designed to terrify anyone even thinking of dissent. The erection of these colossal stones would have been an incredible challenge. Archaeologists believe it was likely accomplished using a combination of brute force, ingenuity, and a deep understanding of leverage and counterweights. A large pit would have been dug for each upright, with one side cut into a gentle slope. The stone would have been dragged to the edge of the pit and then levered and pulled into an upright position, possibly using A-frames and ropes made of plant fibers or leather. Raising the massive lintels to the top of the uprights was an even greater challenge, likely requiring the construction of enormous timber ramps or platforms. The purpose of Stonehenge has been a subject of intense debate for centuries. It was almost certainly a place of profound religious and ceremonial importance. The very alignment of the monument provides a major clue. It is oriented along the axis of the midsummer sunrise and the midwinter sunset. On the longest day of the year, the sun rises directly over the heel stone, which stands just outside the main circle, and its first rays shine into the heart of the monument. On the shortest day, the sun sets perfectly between the uprights of the tallest trilithon. This celestial alignment suggests Stonehenge was a temple, built to celebrate the sun and the changing of the seasons. This makes Stonehenge, in effect, a giant sophisticated calendar. For these early farming communities, tracking the seasons was a matter of life and death. Knowing when to plant crops, when to harvest, and when to prepare for the lean months of winter was crucial for survival. The monument would have allowed them to mark these key points in the year with precision, likely accompanied by great seasonal festivals and rituals. It was a place where the earthly and the celestial worlds met, a way of anchoring the cycles of human life to the grand, eternal cycles of the cosmos. In recent years, another theory has gained significant prominence, that Stonehenge was a place of healing and burial. The large number of human remains found buried at the site, many of them showing signs of serious illness or injury, suggests that people traveled from far and wide to Stonehenge in the hope of being cured. The blue stones, in particular, may have been seen as having therapeutic properties. This would make Stonehenge a kind of prehistoric Lourdes, a pilgrimage site for the sick, and a sacred burial ground for the elite and the revered. The two purposes, as a celestial calendar and a center for healing, are not mutually exclusive and likely coexisted. The area around Stonehenge is as important as the monument itself. Recent archaeological surveys have revealed a vast and complex ritual landscape. This includes the remains of other henges and stone circles, ancient processional avenues, and the site of a large settlement at Durrington Walls, where the builders of Stonehenge are believed to have lived while they worked on the monument. This suggests that Stonehenge was not an isolated structure, but the centerpiece of a much larger sacred area, a kind of prehistoric ritual complex where people gathered for festivals, funerals, and ceremonies that connected them to their ancestors and their cosmos. Who were the people who built Stonehenge? They were not, as was once popularly imagined, Druids. The Druids were the priests of the Celtic peoples, who lived in Britain over 2,000 years after Stonehenge was completed. The builders of Stonehenge were Neolithic and Bronze Age peoples, sophisticated farmers and craftsmen, with a highly organized society and a deep spiritual understanding of the world. Building Stonehenge would have required not just engineering skill but also a stable society that could afford to dedicate thousands of man-hours to a non-utilitarian project. It speaks of a society with strong leadership, a shared belief system, and a vision that spanned generations. The use of Stonehenge as a major ceremonial center appears to have declined around 1500 BC. The reasons are unclear, but may be linked to broader cultural shifts and the arrival of new peoples and beliefs in Britain. The monument was never fully abandoned, but its central importance faded. It fell into silence, a mysterious and imposing ruin on the landscape, its original purpose slowly forgotten, giving way to myth and legend. It became associated with Merlin the magician, with giants, and with the devil himself, as later generations struggled to comprehend how such a place could have been built by their ancestors. Today, Stonehenge continues to be a place of immense power and fascination. It is a symbol of Britain's deep past, a link to a world that is almost beyond our comprehension. It is a masterpiece of engineering, a testament to human determination, and a sacred space that still resonates with a sense of mystery and awe. Every year, thousands of people, from tourists to modern-day pagans and druids, still gather to watch the sun rise on the summer solstice, continuing a tradition that is thousands of years old. Stonehenge reminds us that our desire to understand our place in the universe and to build something that will outlast us is one of the oldest and most powerful of all human impulses. Now let us move from the ancient world to the dawn of the modern one, to a city of light, revolution, and soaring ambition. We are going to Paris in the late 19th century, a time when the city was reinventing itself as the cultural and technological capital of the world. For the 1889 Exposition Universelle, or World's Fair, the French government wanted a monument that would symbolize the nation's industrial prowess and celebrate the centenary of the French Revolution. The result was a structure so radical, so audacious, that it was initially met with outrage and disgust. This is the story of the Eiffel Tower. The man whose name would become inseparable from the tower was Gustave Eiffel. a brilliant engineer and entrepreneur who had already made his name building innovative iron bridges and viaducts across Europe. However, the initial design for the tower did not come from Eiffel himself, but from two senior engineers in his firm, Maurice Koechlin and Émile Nouguier. Their first sketch was a minimalist, almost skeletal pylon, which Eiffel initially dismissed as too austere. It was only when an architect named Stephen Sylvestre was brought in to add decorative arches and other embellishments that Eiffel became convinced of the project's potential and bought the rights to the patent. If you were accused of such a crime, your next stop would likely be the Tower of London. Not the tourist attraction, but a cold, damp fortress of despair. Here, the goal wasn't just confinement. It was to extract a confession, by any means necessary. When the plan for a 300-meter-tall iron tower was made public, it was met with a storm of protest from Paris's artistic and literary establishment. A committee of 300, one member for each meter of the tower's proposed height, was formed to oppose its construction. A petition signed by prominent figures like the writer Guy de Maupassant and the composer Charles Gounod was published in a major newspaper. They decried the tower as a truly tragic street lamp, a hollow candlestick, and a hateful column of bolted sheet metal. They argued that this dizzily ridiculous tower would dominate Paris like a gigantic black smokestack, crushing all the city's beloved monuments beneath its barbaric bulk. Despite the fierce opposition, Gustave Eiffel was a master promoter and a shrewd politician. He defended his project passionately, arguing that it would be a triumph of modern engineering and a powerful symbol of French ingenuity. He secured the funding and the political backing, and construction began in January 1887. The project was a marvel of logistical planning and precision engineering. All 18,038 pieces of wrought iron were prefabricated at Eiffel's factory on the outskirts of Paris, with every hole for the 2.5 million rivets drilled to an accuracy of 1/10 of a millimeter. The construction site on the Champ de Mars was a spectacle of disciplined activity. A relatively small crew of around 300 workers assembled the tower with breathtaking speed and efficiency. They worked in all weather conditions, at dizzying heights, using steam-powered cranes that climbed up the tower as it grew. The pieces arrived on site, already painted in their rust-proof red primer, and were hoisted into place and riveted together. The precision of the prefabricated parts was so great that the entire structure fit together perfectly, like a giant, intricate Meccano set. One of the most remarkable aspects of the tower's construction was its incredible safety record. In an era when large-scale construction projects were notoriously dangerous and fatalities were common, only one worker died during the entire 2-year construction period, and that was off-site and not work-related. This was thanks to Eiffel's obsession with safety. He insisted on the use of movable scaffolding, guardrails, and safety screens. He paid his workers well and provided them with on-site canteens. His meticulous planning and concern for his workers' welfare were as innovative as the tower's design. As the tower grew, public opinion began to shift. The initial disgust slowly turned into grudging admiration and then into outright fascination. Parisians would gather to watch the tower climb higher and higher into the sky, a process that seemed almost magical. The sheer audacity and engineering elegance of the structure began to win people over. It was unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. A lattice of pure structural form that was both incredibly strong and surprisingly light and airy. It was the physical manifestation of the industrial age. The Eiffel Tower was completed in a record time of 2 years, 2 months, and 5 days, finishing on March 31st, 1889, just in time for the opening of the Exposition Universelle. On that day, Gustave Eiffel himself led a group of dignitaries up the stairs to the top of the tower and hoisted a massive French tricolor flag. At 300 meters, it was the tallest man-made structure in the world, snatching the title from the Washington Monument. It would hold that record for the next 41 years until the completion of the Chrysler Building in New York. The tower was an immediate and overwhelming success. During the World's Fair, nearly 2 million people visited, riding the state-of-the-art hydraulic elevators to its various platforms to enjoy the breathtaking, panoramic views of Paris. It became the undisputed symbol of the fair and a source of immense national pride. On the first floor, there were restaurants and cafes. On the second, there was a printing press that produced a daily newspaper, Le Figaro de la Tour. At the very top, Gustav Eiffel built himself a small private apartment where he could entertain guests and conduct meteorological experiments. Despite its popularity, the tower was only ever intended to be a temporary structure. Its contract stipulated that it was to be dismantled after 20 years. Many of its original critics were simply waiting for 1909 to arrive, when this iron monstrosity would finally be torn down. However, the tower had a secret weapon that would ensure its survival: its height. It proved to be an invaluable platform for scientific experiments and, crucially, for the new technology of wireless telegraphy. It became a giant radio antenna, allowing for the first transatlantic radio transmissions and playing a vital role in military communications. During the First World War, the tower's strategic importance became undeniable. The radio transmitter at its peak was used to jam German communications and to intercept enemy messages. In one famous incident at the beginning of the war, the tower's signals helped to disrupt the advance of the German army on Paris, a crucial contribution to the Allied victory at the First Battle of the Marne. The tower had proven its utility beyond all doubt. The idea of dismantling it was now unthinkable. It had saved itself by becoming useful. Over the decades, the Eiffel Tower has cemented its place as one of the most beloved and recognizable landmarks in the world. It has been the site of countless historical events, artistic homages, and daring stunts. It has been repainted 19 times in various colors from reddish brown to its current signature, Eiffel Tower Brown. It has been illuminated in countless creative ways, becoming a sparkling jewel in the Parisian night sky. The very writers who once reviled it came to see it as an essential part of the city's character. Guy de Maupassant, who had hated the tower, was said to have often eaten lunch in its restaurant, explaining that it was the only place in Paris where he couldn't see it. You might be introduced to instruments with deceptively simple names: the rack, which stretched the body, or the scavenger's daughter, a horrific device that compressed it. The goal was to break your will before your formal trial even began. Today, the Eiffel Tower is more than just a tourist attraction. It is the symbol of Paris itself, and by extension, of France. It represents a spirit of innovation, elegance, and artistic daring. It is a monument that began as a controversial engineering project and transformed into a global cultural icon. Its open latticework structure, which allows the Parisian sky to flow through it, has become a metaphor for a certain kind of French spirit, both strong and light, technical and beautiful. The hateful column of bolted sheet metal has become the heart and soul of the City of Light. Let's now journey from the heart of a great European city to the vast open spaces of the American West and into a story that has become a cornerstone of American folklore. We are going to the Little Bighorn River in the Montana Territory in the summer of 1876. This is the story of a dramatic and bloody clash of cultures, a battle that has been mythologized, debated, and reinterpreted for nearly 150 years. It is the story of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, also known as Custer's Last Stand, a shocking defeat for the U.S. Army and the greatest victory for the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors who fought to defend their way of life. The context of the battle was the relentless westward expansion of the United States and the resulting conflict with the Native American tribes of the Great Plains. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 had promised the Lakota and other tribes a great Sioux reservation, which included the sacred Black Hills of South Dakota. The treaty guaranteed that this land would be theirs forever, off limits to white settlement. However, the discovery of gold in the Black Hills in 1874 led to a massive, illegal rush of prospectors and miners into the heart of the reservation, a clear violation of the treaty. The U.S. government, rather than evicting the trespassers, tried to buy the Black Hills from the Lakota. When the tribes, led by influential figures like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, refused to sell their sacred land, the government changed its strategy. It issued an ultimatum. All Lakota and Cheyenne who were living unceded in the hunting grounds of the Powder River Country were to report to their designated agencies by January 31, 1876, or be considered hostile. It was an impossible demand, as travel during the harsh plains winter was out of the question. It was, in effect, a declaration of war. In the spring of 1876, the U.S. Army launched a three-pronged campaign designed to force the hostile bands back onto the reservation. One of these columns was the 7th Cavalry Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. Custer was a flamboyant and controversial figure. He had been a highly successful and daring cavalry commander for the Union during the Civil War, a boy general known for his fearlessness and good luck. But in the post-war army, he was seen by many as arrogant, reckless, and overly ambitious, a man hungry for a glorious victory that could even propel him to the presidency. On the other side was one of the largest gatherings of Native American warriors ever seen on the Great Plains. Drawn together by the spiritual leadership of the Hunkpapa Lakota holy man Sitting Bull and the brilliant military tactics of the Oglala Lakota war chief Crazy Horse, thousands of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho had come together for their annual summer buffalo hunt and Sundance ceremony. By late June, a massive village consisting of an estimated 6,000 to 8,000 people, including at least 500 to 2,000 warriors, was camped in the valley of the Little Bighorn River. They were not seeking a fight, but they were prepared for one. On the morning of June 25, 1876, Custer's scouts located the massive village. Despite his orders to wait for the other army columns to converge, and despite the warnings from his scouts about the overwhelming size of the village, Custer decided to attack immediately. He feared that if he waited, the village would disperse and the opportunity for a decisive battle would be lost. Driven by his characteristic impatience and overconfidence, he made a fateful decision. He divided his command of roughly 650 men into 3 separate battalions, a classic cavalry tactic for striking a large village from multiple directions, but one that severely weakened his force. Custer sent one battalion, under the command of Captain Frederick Benteen, on a wide sweep to the south to cut off any potential escape route. He ordered another battalion, under Major Marcus Reno, to charge directly into the southern end of the village. Custer himself took command of the largest group, 5 companies totaling around 210 men, and rode north along the bluffs, intending to strike the village from the other end. He had drastically underestimated the number of warriors he was facing, and fatally overestimated their willingness to flee. Major Reno's attack was the first to falter. As his 140 men charged towards the village, they were met with a ferocious and overwhelming counterattack. Warriors poured out of the lodges like bees from a hive. Reno's men were quickly forced to dismount and form a skirmish line, but they were in danger of being completely surrounded. Panicked and disorganized, Reno ordered a retreat back across the river and up onto the bluffs. This retreat quickly turned into a chaotic rout, with warriors picking off the fleeing troopers. Reno's surviving men, battered and demoralized, dug in on the bluffs, where they would be besieged for the next 2 days. Meanwhile, Custer and his 210 men had ridden north, searching for a place to ford the river and attack the village. From the bluffs, they likely witnessed the initial part of Reno's charge and its swift repulse. What happened next is the subject of intense historical debate, as none of Custer's immediate command survived to tell their tale. The narrative has been pieced together from Native American accounts and archaeological evidence. It appears Custer rode further north along the ridge, possibly attempting to find a way to relieve Reno, or to capture the women and children at the northern end of the village as hostages. A trial for treason was a piece of theater where the verdict was already written. You would be faced with a panel of judges and a jury who knew that acquitting you could be seen as a treasonous act in itself. Your guilt was a foregone conclusion. He was too late. Warriors, having dealt with Reno's attack, now turned their full attention to Custer's column. Led by chiefs like Crazy Horse and Gall, they swarmed across the river and up the ravines, surrounding Custer's command from all sides. Custer's men were caught in the open. On a long, exposed ridge with little cover, they were outnumbered by at least 10 to 1. The battle dissolved into a series of desperate, isolated stands as the warriors closed in, using the terrain for cover and pouring a relentless fire into the trapped soldiers. The final moments of the battle took place on a rise that came to be known as Last Stand Hill. Here, Custer and the last 40 or so of his men made their final, desperate stand. They likely shot their horses to create makeshift breastworks, fighting back to back as they were overwhelmed. The fight was probably over in less than an hour. It was a complete and utter annihilation. Every single soldier under Custer's direct command was killed, along with Custer himself and several of his relatives who were serving with him. It was a stunning and absolute victory for the combined Lakota and Cheyenne forces. 2 days later, the other U.S. Army columns under Generals Terry and Gibbon arrived at the Little Bighorn. They were met with a horrific sight: the stripped and mutilated bodies of Custer and his men lying where they fell. The battlefield was a scene of carnage. They found and relieved the besieged survivors of Reno and Bentine's commands, who had been unaware of the fate of their commander. The news of the disaster sent shock waves across the United States, arriving just as the nation was celebrating its centennial. The public was stunned and outraged. How could a celebrated hero like Custer and his entire command be wiped out by savages? In the immediate aftermath, the U.S. government and media created a powerful myth. Custer was portrayed as a heroic martyr, a noble soldier making a glorious last stand against overwhelming odds. The blame for the disaster was placed on everyone but Custer himself, on Major Reno for his cowardice, on Captain Bentine for failing to come to his aid, and on the supposed failure of the government to provide enough troops. This narrative of heroic sacrifice dominated the public's understanding of the battle for decades, immortalized in paintings, books, and later in films. The victory at the Little Bighorn was, however, the last great triumph for the Plains tribes. The U.S. Army, stung by the defeat and fueled by a public cry for revenge, redoubled its efforts. Thousands more troops were sent west. The hostiles were relentlessly pursued throughout the following winter, their villages destroyed, their pony herds captured, and their food supplies cut off. One by one, the starving and exhausted bands were forced to surrender and return to the reservation. Within a year, most of the leaders, including Crazy Horse, had surrendered. Sitting Bull and his followers escaped to Canada, but they too would eventually be forced by starvation to return. The Battle of the Little Bighorn remains one of the most studied and contested events in American history. Over time, the heroic Custer's Last Stand myth has been deconstructed and replaced by a more complex and nuanced understanding. Historians now recognize Custer's recklessness and poor tactical decisions as a primary cause of the disaster. More importantly, the battle is now seen not just from the perspective of the U.S. Army, but also from the perspective of the Native Americans who fought there. For them, it was not a massacre, but a defensive battle fought to protect their families, their land, and their way of life against an invading force. It was their greatest victory, but it ultimately sealed their fate. Let's shift our focus now, from a battle on the plains to a silent, creeping terror in the heart of a great city. We are going to London in the mid-19th century, a city that was the vibrant, crowded, and filthy center of a global empire. In the summer of 1854, a deadly and mysterious disease erupted in the Soho district, killing hundreds of people in a matter of days. In a time when diseases were blamed on bad air or moral failing, one man, through meticulous investigation and a revolutionary idea, would pinpoint the true source of the outbreak and change the course of public health forever. This is the story of Dr. John Snow and the Broad Street cholera pump. Cholera was one of the most feared diseases of the 19th century. Its symptoms were terrifying and swift. A perfectly healthy person could fall ill in the morning and be dead by nightfall. The disease caused severe diarrhea and vomiting, leading to rapid dehydration, muscle cramps, and a bluish-gray tint to the skin, which is why it was sometimes called the Blue Death. It was a brutal and undignified end. Epidemics would sweep through the rapidly growing, unsanitary cities of Europe and America, leaving trails of devastation and panic. The prevailing scientific theory of the time for how diseases like cholera spread was the, miasma theory. This theory held that diseases were caused by, miasma, which was essentially bad air or night air. It was believed that the foul smells emanating from sewage, garbage, and other decaying organic matter were the direct cause of illness. This theory, while incorrect, seemed to make a certain kind of sense. The poorest and most crowded parts of the city, which were also the smelliest, were invariably the hardest hit by epidemics. The solution, therefore, was thought to be ventilation and eliminating foul odors. Dr. John Snow, a respected London physician and a pioneer in the field of anesthesia, he had administered chloroform to Queen Victoria during childbirth, was skeptical of the miasma theory. He had observed previous cholera outbreaks and noticed that the disease seemed to follow a different pattern. It often affected the gut first, which suggested it was something ingested, not inhaled. He suspected that cholera was not airborne, but was instead a waterborne disease spread through contaminated drinking water. This was a radical idea at the time, and he had no definitive proof. The 1854 Soho outbreak would give him his chance to find it. This era saw the rise of what historians call the Bloody Code. The number of offenses punishable by death swelled to include things like cutting down a tree or being out at night with a blackened face. The law was a tool of terror. In late August 1854, a particularly virulent cholera outbreak began in the Soho district of London. The neighborhood was a densely packed warren of homes and businesses, with a population of both wealthy merchants and impoverished laborers. The outbreak was explosive. In the first 3 days, 127 people died. Within 10 days, over 500 people were dead. The neighborhood was gripped by panic. Residents who could afford to fled the city. Businesses closed down. It was a public health catastrophe on a terrifying scale. While other doctors were recommending that people avoid the bad air, John Snow began to investigate the outbreak in a systematic and logical way. He went from house to house, interviewing the families of the victims. He was not just a doctor, he was a detective. He recorded the details of each death, and most importantly, he asked a crucial question: where did the deceased get their drinking water? In 19th-century London, before homes had running water, people got their water from communal pumps located on the street. As Snow collected his data, a clear pattern began to emerge. The vast majority of the deaths were clustered around one particular public water pump, located on the corner of Broad Street, now Broadwick Street. To visualize his findings, Snow did something revolutionary. He created a map of the Soho neighborhood, marking the location of each cholera death with a small black bar. The resulting map was a stunning piece of data visualization. It showed a dense concentration of black bars surrounding the Broad Street pump. The further away a home was from that pump, the fewer deaths there were. The map made it visually obvious that the pump was the epicenter of the outbreak. Snow's investigation also turned up crucial anecdotal evidence that supported his theory. He found a workhouse near the pump that had suffered almost no deaths. When he investigated, he found that the workhouse had its own private well and did not use water from the Broad Street pump. He also discovered that a local brewery on the same street had no deaths among its workers. The reason? The workers were given a daily allowance of beer and rarely, if ever, drank water from the pump. These were the control groups that helped to prove his hypothesis. The most compelling piece of evidence, the smoking gun of his investigation, came from a case far from Soho. He learned of a woman who had died of cholera in the distant suburb of Hampstead. This was an anomaly that seemed to contradict his theory. But when Snow investigated, he discovered that the woman had once lived in Soho and had developed a particular fondness for the taste of the water from the Broad Street pump. She had a bottle of it delivered to her home in Hampstead every day. She and her visiting niece, who also drank the water, both died of cholera. No one else in her neighborhood contracted the disease. Armed with this overwhelming body of evidence, both statistical and anecdotal, John Snow went before the local Board of Guardians on September 7, 1854. He presented his map and his findings, arguing that the Broad Street pump was the source of the contamination and that its handle should be removed. The board members were skeptical. They still believed in the miasma theory, but the evidence Snow presented was so compelling, and the situation so desperate, that they agreed to take a chance on his radical idea. The next day, the handle of the Broad Street pump was removed, making it impossible to draw water from it. The effect was almost immediate. The number of new cholera cases in the neighborhood dropped dramatically. The outbreak was effectively over. While it's true that the epidemic was likely already waning as people had fled the area, the removal of the pump handle was a powerfully symbolic and practical act. Snow had proven his point. Later investigations would reveal the source of the contamination. The well of the Broad Street pump had been dug only a few feet from an old cesspool. A sick infant's contaminated diapers had been emptied into this cesspool, and the cholera bacteria had seeped through the decaying brickwork into the well, poisoning the entire neighborhood's water supply. Despite the dramatic success of his investigation, John Snow's germ theory of disease was not immediately accepted by the wider scientific community. The miasma theory was deeply entrenched and would hold sway for several more years. The official reports on the Soho outbreak, published by the government, dismissed Snow's findings and concluded that miasma was still the most likely cause. It was only with the later work of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, who definitively identified the microorganisms responsible for diseases, that Snow's pioneering work was finally vindicated. The story of John Snow and the Broad Street Pump is a landmark moment in the history of science and public health. It is a classic example of the epidemiological method, the use of mapping, statistics, and logical deduction to understand the cause and spread of a disease. Snow's map was a forerunner of modern disease mapping and geographic information systems, GIS. His meticulous, shoe-leather detective work laid the foundation for how we investigate and control epidemics to this day. He demonstrated that by understanding the mechanism of transmission, we can intervene to break the chain of infection, even before we know the specific germ that is causing the illness. The legacy of John Snow's work is all around us, in the clean water that flows from our taps, and the sanitation systems that protect our cities. His investigation was a crucial catalyst for the Great Stink of 1858 in London, which finally spurred the government to invest in a massive, modern sewer system, designed by the engineer Joseph Basil Jett. This monumental public works project, which separated sewage from drinking water, dramatically improved the health of Londoners and became a model for cities around the world. John Snow, the quiet doctor who trusted evidence over dogma, helped to save countless lives and build the foundations of the modern, healthy city. A replica of the pump, with its handle removed, still stands on Broadwick Street today, a monument to a man who taught the world to think differently about disease. If sentenced to hang, you would take your final journey on a cart to a place like Tyburn, just outside London. This procession was a massive public event, a grim parade where the condemned were the main attraction, either jeered or pitied by the throngs. Now let's leave the crowded streets of London and travel to a place of stark, windswept beauty and profound isolation. We're heading to a small, remote island in the southeastern Pacific Ocean, one of the most isolated inhabited places on Earth. It's a place famous for its silent, enigmatic statues, and for the mystery of the civilization that created them, a civilization that ultimately collapsed. This is the story of Rapa Nui, known to the outside world as Easter Island, a powerful and cautionary tale of human ingenuity, environmental fragility, and societal collapse. Rapa Nui is a tiny triangle of volcanic rock, more than 2,000 miles from the coast of Chile and 200 miles from the nearest inhabited island. It was first settled around 1200 AD by a small group of Polynesian voyagers who had navigated the vast expanse of the Pacific in double-hulled canoes, an incredible feat of seamanship. They brought with them the plants and animals they would need to survive, like taro, bananas, and chickens. In this remote and isolated environment, they developed a unique and complex culture, completely cut off from the rest of the world for centuries. The most famous and enduring legacy of this culture are the moai, the colossal stone statues that dot the island's coastline. There are nearly 900 of these statues, carved between approximately 1250 and 1500 AD. The moai are monolithic figures, representing deified ancestors. They were believed to be repositories of mana, or spiritual power, which would protect the clans and ensure the fertility of the land. They are characterized by their oversized heads, long ears, and heavy brows, with their torsos often buried underground. They are not just statues. They are the silent, powerful guardians of the island's clans. The creation and transportation of the moai was a monumental undertaking. The statues were carved directly from the solidified volcanic tuff of a single quarry, a crater known as Rano Raraku. Here you can still see nearly 400 moai in various stages of completion, some still attached to the rock face, others lying abandoned on the slopes. The largest completed moai is over 33 feet tall and weighs a staggering 82 tons. One unfinished statue, nicknamed El Gigante, would have been over 70 feet tall and weighed an estimated 270 tons. It is a breathtaking testament to the ambition and skill of the Rapa Nui people. How the Rapa Nui people moved these colossal statues from the quarry to their final positions on coastal platforms, known as AHU, has been a source of intense debate and speculation for centuries. Early theories involved extraterrestrials, or a lost high technology. The reality is a story of human ingenuity and immense coordinated labor. The island's oral traditions speak of the moai walking to their platforms. Modern experiments have shown that this was likely possible. By using ropes and a large team of people, A moai could be rocked from side to side and walked forward in a shuffling motion, much like moving a heavy refrigerator. Another theory suggests the moai were laid on their backs on wooden sledges and pulled over a ladder of logs. Both methods would have required a huge amount of timber and rope. This brings us to the central tragedy of the Rapa Nui story: deforestation. When the Polynesians first arrived, the island was covered in a lush subtropical forest, dominated by a species of giant palm tree that was perfect for making canoes, building houses, and, crucially, for transporting the moai. Pollen analysis from lakebed sediment cores has shown that this forest completely disappeared over the course of a few centuries. The Rapa Nui people, in their isolated world, had cleared the entire forest. They cut down the trees to clear land for agriculture, to use as firewood, and to aid in the construction and transportation of the ever larger moai. This deforestation had catastrophic consequences. Without the trees, the soil eroded, leading to a decline in crop yields. Without wood for canoes, they could no longer fish effectively in the deep sea, losing a vital source of protein. They were trapped on a barren island, their resources dwindling. The societal pressure created by this environmental collapse appears to have been immense. The statue-building era, which likely involved a great deal of competition between different clans to erect the biggest and most impressive moai, came to an abrupt halt. The quarry at Ranoraku was abandoned, the tools dropped where they lay. What followed seems to have been a period of civil war and social breakdown. The once revered moai were toppled from their platforms by rival clans, their mana symbolically destroyed. The island's population, which may have been as high as 15,000 at its peak, crashed to just a few thousand. In this period of crisis, a new and strange cult emerged, known as the Birdman cult. The focus of ritual activities shifted from the ancestor-worshipping moai to a competition centered on the sacred site of Orongo, a village of low stone huts perched on the edge of a dramatic sea cliff. Each year, champions from the different clans would compete to be the first to collect the egg of a sooty tern from a small, treacherous islet just offshore. The winner's clan would rule the island for the next year. It was a desperate, high-stakes ritual that replaced the cooperative effort of statue building with a brutal, individualistic competition. When the first European explorers arrived in the 18th century, beginning with the Dutch navigator Jacob Roggeveen on Easter Sunday 1722, hence the island's western name, they found a treeless, impoverished land inhabited by a small population. They were mystified. How could these few people have created and erected the magnificent statues that stood and lay toppled all around them? They could not reconcile the evidence of a great, organized past with the impoverished present they witnessed. Strangely, you were often allowed to give a final speech from the gallows. It was a last chance to confess your sins, warn others away from a life of crime, or, for the very brave, to declare your innocence one final time before the end. The final blows to the Rapa Nui culture came in the 19th century. Peruvian slave raiders abducted a significant portion of the remaining population, including the last of the elders who knew how to read the island's unique and still undeciphered script, known as Rongorongo. The few who were eventually returned brought smallpox with them, which devastated the remaining population. By 1877, only a little over 100 Rapa Nui people were left alive. An entire, unique human culture had been pushed to the very brink of extinction. The story of Rapa Nui has often been used as a powerful, almost parable-like cautionary tale for the entire planet. It's seen as a story of ecocide, a society that destroyed itself by overexploiting its limited resources, a microcosm of the environmental challenges facing the world today. This interpretation, most famously popularized by the scientist and author Jared Diamond, paints a stark picture of a civilization that, through short-sightedness and competitive zeal, chopped down its last tree and sealed its own doom. However, in recent years, this classic collapse narrative has been challenged and nuanced by some archaeologists, and by the Rapa Nui people themselves. They argue that the story is not just one of self-inflicted ecological disaster, but also one of incredible resilience. The Rapa Nui people did not simply die out. They survived the environmental challenges, adapted their agricultural practices to the new, harsher conditions, and created a new social order. This view places more emphasis on the devastating impact of outside contact, slavery, and disease as the primary cause of the final cultural collapse, rather than purely internal environmental factors. Regardless of the exact sequence of events, The story of Rapa Nui remains a profound and sobering lesson. It's a story of the delicate balance between human ambition, culture, and the environment. The silent, staring moai are a haunting reminder that even the most creative and organized societies are ultimately dependent on the health of their ecosystem. They stand as timeless monuments to a lost world, powerful symbols of both the incredible heights of human achievement and the tragic consequences of exceeding the limits of a small, isolated island, a lonely outpost in the vastness of the sea. Now, let us travel from the Pacific to the Mediterranean, and back to a time of classical antiquity. We're going to the city of Alexandria in Roman Egypt, in the late 4th and early 5th centuries AD. It was a city of immense learning and violent religious turmoil. In this cauldron of clashing ideas, one of the most remarkable figures of the ancient world lived and worked, a brilliant philosopher, mathematician, and astronomer who was also a woman. This is the story of Hypatia of Alexandria, a symbol of reason and learning in a world descending into fanaticism, whose life and brutal death marked a turning point in the intellectual history of the West. Hypatia was born around 350 or 370 AD in Alexandria. The city was a beacon of intellectual life, home to the great library and the museum, institutions that had made it the scholarly capital of the Hellenistic world for centuries. Hypatia's father was Theon, a renowned mathematician and astronomer who was himself a scholar at the museum. Unusually for the time, Theon was determined to give his daughter the best possible education. He personally instructed her in mathematics and philosophy, ensuring she was immersed in the world of Greek rationalism and scientific inquiry from a young age. Hypatia quickly surpassed her father in intellect and reputation. She became a leading scholar in her own right, a prominent teacher of philosophy and mathematics. She was a leading figure in the Neoplatonist school of philosophy, a system of thought that sought to reconcile the teachings of Plato with a more mystical, spiritual understanding of the universe. Students, both pagan and Christian, flocked from all over the Mediterranean world to attend her lectures. She was renowned not only for her brilliant mind, but also for her eloquence, her charisma, and her virtuous character. She chose a life of celibacy and dedicated herself entirely to the pursuit of knowledge. Hypatia was more than just a philosopher. She was a practicing scientist and mathematician. She wrote commentaries on classic mathematical texts, such as Diophantus's Arithmetica and Apollonius's Conics. While none of her original written works survive, we know from contemporary accounts that she was deeply involved in practical scientific work. She is credited with assisting her father in revising Ptolemy's Almagest, the foundational text of ancient astronomy, and she is said to have invented or improved upon scientific instruments like the astrolabe, used for astronomical measurements, and the hydrometer, used for measuring the density of liquids. Hypatia lived during a time of intense and often violent religious conflict. The Roman Empire was in the process of transitioning from paganism to Christianity. Alexandria was a flashpoint for this struggle. The city was home to a large and fervent Christian population, led by a powerful and aggressive archbishop, but it also had significant pagan and Jewish communities, as well as a powerful intellectual elite that clung to the classical traditions of Greek philosophy and science. The streets of Alexandria were frequently the scene of riots and clashes between these competing factions. Hypatia, a pagan woman who embodied the ideals of Greek rationalism, found herself in a precarious position. She was highly respected and moved in the city's highest political circles. She was a close friend and advisor to Orestes, the Roman prefect or governor of Alexandria. This friendship and her immense public influence brought her into direct conflict with the city's powerful and ambitious Christian bishop Cyril. Cyril saw the influence of pagan intellectuals like Hypatia as a direct threat to his own authority and to the dominance of the Christian church. The end itself was brutal. Hanging was often by short drop, meaning a slow and agonizing death by strangulation, not a quick snap of the neck. It was a final, horrifying lesson for all who watched, a spectacle of the state's absolute power. The political situation in Alexandria became increasingly toxic. Orestes and Cyril were locked in a bitter power struggle for control of the city. Hypatia, as a close confidant of Orestes, was inevitably drawn into this conflict. Rumors began to spread among Cyril's more fanatical followers, particularly a militant group of monks known as the Parabolani. They began to paint Hypatia as a malevolent figure, a sorceress who was using her influence to turn the governor against the Christian faith and to prevent a reconciliation between Orestes and Cyril. She became the scapegoat for the city's political tensions. In March of 415 AD, the situation reached its horrific climax. As Hypatia was riding in her chariot through the city, she was ambushed by a mob of Christian fanatics, led by a man named Peter the Lector. They dragged her from her chariot and took her to a recently converted church called the Caesareum. There, in a frenzy of religious zealotry, they stripped her naked and brutally murdered her. According to the contemporary Christian historian Socrates Scholasticus, they used ostraca, sharp pieces of pottery or oyster shells, to flay her skin from her body. They then dismembered her and burned her remains. The murder of Hypatia was a shocking and brutal act that sent ripples throughout the Roman Empire. It was a stark demonstration of the rising power of religious fanaticism and the dangers faced by those who represented the old world of classical learning and rational inquiry. While Bishop Cyril's direct involvement in ordering the murder has never been proven, his inflammatory rhetoric and his demonization of Hypatia undoubtedly created the climate of hatred that made such an atrocity possible. He did nothing to stop it and nothing to punish the perpetrators. The event permanently stained his reputation and highlighted the violent intolerance that was taking hold in certain corners of the early church. The death of Hypatia has often been romanticized and mythologized as the symbolic end of classical antiquity. She is sometimes portrayed as the last defender of the Library of Alexandria, a martyr for science standing against the tide of religious ignorance that would usher in the Dark Ages. While this narrative is powerful, it is a simplification. The library had already been in decline for centuries and likely no longer existed in its grand form by Hypatia's time. And learning did not simply cease with her death. However, her murder was undeniably a watershed moment. Her death marked a turning point in the intellectual climate of Alexandria. It sent a chilling message to the city's remaining pagan scholars and philosophers. Many of them, fearing for their own lives, either converted to Christianity, went into hiding, or fled the city altogether. The open, pluralistic intellectual environment that had defined Alexandria for centuries was effectively destroyed. The center of Greek philosophical and scientific inquiry began to shift away from the Christianizing Roman Empire, moving east towards Persia and the Islamic world, where the classical texts would be preserved and built upon during Europe's medieval period. Hypatia's story was largely forgotten for over 1,000 years. It was rediscovered during the Enlightenment in the 18th century, and she was resurrected as a powerful symbol. For Enlightenment thinkers who championed reason over faith, she became a martyr for science, a feminist icon, and a victim of religious intolerance. Her story was a cautionary tale about the dangers of dogma and fanaticism. This image was further cemented in the 19th century by writers and artists who romanticized her as a beautiful, tragic heroine of the ancient world. Today, Hypatia of Alexandria is remembered as a figure of immense courage and intellectual brilliance. She was a woman who dared to excel in fields dominated by men, who commanded respect through the power of her intellect and the integrity of her character. Her life is a testament to the enduring power of reason, critical inquiry, and the pursuit of knowledge. Her tragic death serves as a permanent and sobering reminder of how fragile those values can be, and how quickly the light of reason can be extinguished by the darkness of hatred and intolerance. Now, let us travel to the Renaissance, a time of artistic genius and political intrigue, and to the heart of Italy. We are going to explore the life and work of a man whose name is synonymous with political cunning and ruthless pragmatism. His most famous work was so infamous that his very name became an adjective for deceit and manipulation. This is the story of Niccolò Machiavelli, the Florentine diplomat and political philosopher, whose unflinching look at the true nature of power would change political thought forever. Niccolò Machiavelli was born in Florence in 1469, into a time of great political instability. Italy was not a unified country, but a collection of warring city-states, all vying for power and constantly threatened by foreign invaders from France and Spain. Florence itself was a republic, but it had long been dominated by the wealthy and powerful Medici family. In 1494, when Machiavelli was a young man, the Medici were driven from the city, and a new, more genuinely republican government was established. This was the moment Machiavelli entered public life. In 1498, Machiavelli was appointed to a high-ranking position in the new Florentine government. He became the second chancellor, and also the secretary to the Ten of War, a powerful committee responsible for diplomacy and military affairs. For the next 14 years, he served as a dedicated and effective public servant. He was sent on dozens of diplomatic missions to the major powers of the day, including the court of the French king, the Holy Roman Emperor, and, most importantly, to the court of Cesare Borgia, the ambitious and utterly ruthless son of Pope Alexander VI. And as you settle in, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight. It's always a quiet joy to see how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan, or pull the blankets up a little higher. Close your eyes, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. This was the world of Tudor justice, a system built on fear, shame, and public display, where a single misstep could send you down a path of pain and humiliation. It was a brutal way to keep order, a constant, nagging reminder to simply keep your head down. Machiavelli's time as a diplomat was his political education. He was a keen observer of people and power. He saw firsthand how rulers succeeded and how they failed. He witnessed treaties being made and broken, the brutal realities of warfare, and the constant interplay of ambition, betrayal, and violence that characterized the politics of his time. In particular, he was both horrified and deeply impressed by Cesare Borgia, who used a combination of charm, deception, and shocking cruelty to carve out a new state for himself in central Italy. Borgia was a master of the dark arts of power, and Machiavelli was taking careful notes. Machiavelli's successful career came to an abrupt end in 1512. The Medici family, with the help of Spanish troops, returned to power in Florence and overthrew the Republic. As a prominent official of the former government, Machiavelli was immediately dismissed from his post. Worse was to come. In 1513, he was falsely accused of being part of a conspiracy against the Medici. He was arrested, imprisoned, and subjected to torture on the rack. Despite the agonizing pain, he maintained his innocence and was eventually released. His political career in ruins, Machiavelli was exiled from Florence and retired to his small family farm. He was devastated. He missed the excitement and importance of public life. To occupy his mind and, he hoped, to win his way back into the good graces of the new Medici rulers, he began to write. He wrote plays, histories, and, most famously, a short book on political philosophy that he would dedicate to the new Medici prince, Lorenzo de' Medici. This book was The Prince. The Prince is one of the most revolutionary and controversial books ever written. It completely broke with the traditional Mirror for Princes genre, which advised rulers to be virtuous, just, and merciful in accordance with Christian morality. Machiavelli threw all of that out the window. His book was not about how a prince should ideally behave, but about how a prince must behave in the real world if he wants to gain and maintain power. It was a cold, unflinching look at the mechanics of power, completely divorced from traditional morality. The central message of The Prince is that a ruler must be willing to do whatever it takes to secure his state. This includes being deceitful, cruel, and manipulative when necessary. Machiavelli famously argued that it is better for a prince to be feared than to be loved, because love is fickle, but fear is constant. He wrote that a prince should be like a lion, to frighten away the wolves, and also like a fox, to recognize the traps. He argued that a ruler who is always good will inevitably be destroyed by the many who are not good. The ends, the stability and security of the state, justified the means. This was shocking stuff. Machiavelli was not advocating for cruelty for its own sake. He distinguished between cruelty that is well used and cruelty that is ill used. Well-used cruelty is swift, decisive, and applied all at once to secure power, after which the prince can return to a more benevolent rule. Ill-used cruelty is constant and nagging, which only breeds hatred and instability. He was not an evil man. He was a political realist. He believed that the chaos and suffering caused by a weak and indecisive ruler were far worse than the necessary evils a strong ruler might have to commit to maintain order. The prince failed in its immediate purpose. The Medici rulers were not impressed, and Machiavelli was never offered the high-level government position he craved. The book was not even published in his lifetime. When it was finally printed 5 years after his death, it caused an immediate scandal. The Catholic Church placed it on its index of prohibited books. He was denounced as a teacher of evil, a demon, an old Nick who was in league with the devil. The adjective Machiavellian entered the language as a synonym for cunning, amoral, and treacherous behavior. This popular interpretation, however, misses the nuance and the patriotic passion that drove Machiavelli. He was a Florentine patriot who had seen his beloved Italy torn apart by foreign armies and incompetent rulers. He was writing out of a desperate desire to see a strong, unified Italian leader emerge, who could drive out the barbarians and restore Italy to its former glory. The Prince was a handbook for that potential savior. It was a desperate plea for a ruler with the strength and ruthlessness to put an end to the chaos. In addition to The Prince, Machiavelli also wrote a much longer and arguably more important work called the Discourses on Livy. In this book, he reveals his true political preference, not for a prince, but for a republic. He argued that a republic, with its system of laws, citizen participation, and healthy conflict between the social classes, was a much more stable, resilient, and glorious form of government than a principality, which depended entirely on the character of a single ruler. The Prince was a guide for founding a state in a time of crisis. The Discourses was a guide for how to maintain it in the long run. The legacy of Niccolo Machiavelli is complex and enduring. He is often called the father of modern political science, because he was one of the first thinkers to study politics as it is, not as it ought to be. He treated politics as a human science, observable and analyzable, rather than as an extension of religious morality. He understood that the world of politics has its own set of rules, which are often brutal and unpleasant, but which must be understood by anyone who wants to be effective in that world. Now, let us leave the grim streets of Tudor London and drift into a different age. An age of steam, steel, and unprecedented luxury. We turn our minds to a legend of the rails, a name that still evokes mystery, romance, and the golden age of travel, the Orient Express. Its story isn't just about a train. It's about a revolutionary idea, a dream of connecting West and East not just by geography, but by an experience of unparalleled opulence. The vision belonged to a Belgian named Georges Nagelmakers, who, after a trip to America, was inspired by the Pullman sleeper cars but felt he could do it better. He imagined not just a comfortable way to cross countries, but a rolling five-star hotel, a palace on wheels that would shrink the continent and make the journey as magnificent as the destination itself. Whether we see him as a cynical teacher of evil or a clear-eyed political realist, Machiavelli's influence is undeniable. His work forced a conversation about the relationship between ethics and politics that continues to this day. He asked uncomfortable questions about the price of power and the cost of stability. His insights into human nature, that people are generally self-interested, ungrateful, and driven by fear and ambition, still resonate with a chilling accuracy. He peeled back the curtain of political life and showed us the cold, hard machinery that often lies beneath the noble rhetoric. Let's turn our attention now to the world of art, to a movement that shattered tradition and taught the world a new way of seeing. We are going to Paris in the 1860s and 1870s, to the smoky cafes and bohemian studios where a group of rebellious young artists would challenge the establishment and create one of the most beloved and revolutionary art movements in history. This is the story of Impressionism, a revolution of light and color that captured the fleeting moments of modern life. In the mid-19th century, the French art world was dominated by the Académie des Beaux-Arts, the Royal Academy of Fine Arts. The Academy dictated what was considered good art. It prized historical scenes, mythological subjects, and formal portraits. The approved style was highly polished and realistic, with smooth, invisible brushstrokes and a somber, brownish color palette. The most important event in the art world was the annual Salon, a massive, juried exhibition organized by the Academy. To be accepted into the Salon was to have a career. To be rejected was to be a failure. A group of young, ambitious artists, including Claude Monet, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Edgar Degas, and Camille Pissarro, grew increasingly frustrated with the conservative, backward-looking standards of the Academy. They were not interested in painting scenes from ancient history. They wanted to paint the world around them, the modern life of Paris. They were interested in landscapes, cityscapes, and scenes of everyday leisure. People strolling in the park, enjoying a boat ride, or sitting in a cafe. They wanted to capture the immediate, sensory experience of a particular moment. To capture this sense of immediacy, they developed a radical new way of painting. Instead of working in a studio, they took their easels outdoors, en plein air, to paint directly from nature. This allowed them to observe the changing effects of light and atmosphere. They used bright, pure colors, often applying them directly to the canvas without mixing them on the palette first. Their brushstrokes were short, thick, and visible, designed to capture the impression of a scene rather than its precise details. They were less interested in the object itself and more interested in how the light reflected off of it. These new techniques were shocking to the art establishment. The visible brushwork was seen as sloppy and unfinished. The bright colors were considered garish and vulgar. The everyday subject matter was deemed trivial and unworthy of serious art. Unsurprisingly, their work was consistently rejected by the salon jury. Frustrated and determined to show their work to the public on their own terms, they decided to do something unprecedented. They organized their own independent exhibition. In April 1874, the group, calling themselves the Anonymous Society of Painters, Sculptors, Engravers, etc., held their first exhibition in the former studio of the photographer Nadar. The show was a critical disaster. The public and the critics were baffled and outraged by what they saw. One of the most ridiculed paintings was a work by Claude Monet depicting the port of his hometown at sunrise. Its title was Impression, Sunrise. Seizing on this title, a hostile critic named Louis Leroy wrote a scathing review in which he mockingly labeled the entire group the Impressionists. The name, intended as an insult, stuck. Despite the initial public ridicule, the Impressionists were undeterred. They held 8 group exhibitions between 1874 and 1886. They were a diverse group of individuals with different styles and interests, but they were united by a spirit of independence and a desire to forge a new path for art. Claude Monet was obsessed with capturing the fleeting effects of light on water and landscapes, famously painting the same subject, like haystacks or the Rouen Cathedral, over and over again at different times of day and in different seasons. Pierre-Auguste Renoir focused on the human figure, painting joyful, sun-dappled scenes of people at leisure. His paintings, like Bal du Moulin de la Galette, are celebrations of life, filled with warmth, light, and vibrant color. Edgar Degas, on the other hand, was more of an urban realist. He was fascinated by the artificial light of the theater and the opera, and he is famous for his paintings and sculptures of ballet dancers, capturing their unguarded moments in rehearsal or backstage. He was a master of composition and capturing movement. Another key figure was the female artist Berthe Morisot. In a time when it was very difficult for women to become professional artists, Morisot was a founding member of the Impressionist group and exhibited in almost all of their shows. Her work is known for its delicate touch and its intimate focus on the domestic lives of women and children, subjects that were often accessible to her when the male artist's public world was not. Her paintings offer a unique and valuable perspective within the movement. The inaugural journey of what was then called the Express d'Orient set off from Paris's Gare de l'Est on October 4, 1883. It was a momentous occasion, a spectacle of industrial might and Gilded Age extravagance. The guest list was a curated collection of journalists, dignitaries, and adventurers, all eager to witness this new marvel. The train itself was a vision in polished teak and gleaming brass, its midnight blue carriages a stark contrast to the grimy, utilitarian trains of the day. As it pulled out of the station hissing steam and thunder, it wasn't just beginning a trip to Constantinople. It was steaming directly into legend, carrying with it the promise of a new, more glamorous world of travel, a world where the journey was an event in its own right. The Impressionists' revolution was not just about style. It was about a new way of seeing the world. They were influenced by the new science of optics, which was exploring the nature of light and color. They were also influenced by the newly imported art of Japanese woodblock prints, with their bold compositions, flat areas of color, and unusual cropping. And they were deeply connected to the rise of photography, which freed painters from the need to create a perfectly realistic record of the world and encouraged them to explore more subjective and personal visions. Over time, public and critical opinion began to change. A forward-thinking art dealer named Paul Durand Ruel became a crucial champion of the Impressionists, buying their work when no one else would and promoting it through exhibitions in London and New York. By the late 1880s, the movement had gained widespread acceptance, and the artists who had once been ridiculed were now being celebrated. Impressionism had become one of the most influential and popular art movements in history. The legacy of Impressionism is immense. It fundamentally changed the course of Western art. By breaking free from the Academy and its rigid rules, the Impressionists opened the door for all of modern art. Their emphasis on individual perception, their bold use of color, and their experimental techniques paved the way for later movements like post-impressionism, fauvism, and cubism. They taught artists that they could paint what they wanted, how they wanted. Beyond the art world, Impressionism has had a profound impact on our visual culture. The movement's focus on capturing the beauty of everyday life, the fleeting moment, and the play of light has shaped our modern aesthetic sensibilities. The images they created, of Parisian cafes, sunny landscapes, and water lilies floating on a pond, have become some of the most beloved and iconic images in the world. They taught us to find beauty not just in grand historical events, but in the simple, transient moments of our own lives. As our journey for tonight comes to a close, we can reflect on the threads that connect these disparate tales. From the grim justice of Tudor England to the defiant artists of Paris, from the tragic ambition of the Franklin expedition to the pragmatic ruthlessness of Machiavelli, we see a recurring pattern. We see the clash between old orders and new ideas, the struggle between human ambition and the constraints of the world, whether those constraints are the Arctic ice, a fragile ecosystem, or the rigid rules of an art academy. History is not just a collection of dates and events. It is a vast collection of human stories, of people trying to make sense of their world, to impose order on chaos, to create something beautiful, or simply to survive. It is a story of incredible ingenuity and of tragic folly, of profound cruelty and of surprising compassion. And as we drift off to sleep, we can find a strange comfort in these stories. They remind us of the resilience of the human spirit, the endless capacity for both creation and destruction, and the simple fact that our own lives are part of this long, complex, and endlessly fascinating story. Until next time, sleep well. To step aboard the Orient Express in its heyday was to enter a self-contained world of impossible luxury. Georges Nagelmakers had obsessed over every detail, determined to outdo the finest hotels in Paris or Vienna. The carriages were crafted by the most skilled artisans in Europe. The walls were paneled with intricate marquetry, elaborate inlays of exotic woods like mahogany, rosewood, and tulip wood, polished to a mirror shine. Underfoot, plush carpets from Turkey deadened the sound of the rumbling wheels, and overhead, ceilings were adorned with embossed leather. Every fixture, from the luggage racks to the door handles, was made of heavy, gleaming brass, meticulously polished by the crew each day. It was a sensory overload of craftsmanship, a testament to an era that believed beauty was a necessary part of function. The sleeping compartments were masterpieces of efficient design and lavish comfort. By day, they were elegant private lounges with plush velvet sofas and small tables. At night, while passengers were at dinner, the discreet and almost invisible stewards would transform the space. The sofa would convert into a comfortable bed with fine linen sheets and a down-filled duvet. A small, hidden wash basin with hot and cold running water, a miracle of modern engineering at the time, would be revealed, complete with silver-plated fixtures. Every detail was considered, from the silk lampshades that cast a warm, gentle glow to the crystal carafes of fresh water provided each evening. It was a private sanctuary, a cozy haven to watch the landscapes of Europe slide past your window. But the true heart of the Orient Express, the nexus of its social world, was the dining car. Here, passengers shed the grime of travel and donned their evening finest. The room glittered under the light of ornate lamps, the glow reflecting off polished silver and sparkling crystal glasses, each engraved with the train's elegant monogram. The tables were set with crisp white damask tablecloths, heavy silver cutlery, and fine china. This was not merely a place to eat. It was a grand restaurant that just happened to be moving at 50 miles per hour. The gentle sway of the carriage, the clinking of glasses, and the low hum of conversation from a dozen different languages created a unique and unforgettable ambiance, a sense of shared adventure and cosmopolitan glamour. The menu in the dining car was as ambitious as the train itself. The chefs who worked in the cramped, perpetually moving galley were masters of their craft. capable of producing multi-course gourmet meals that would rival the best restaurants in Paris. Fresh ingredients were taken on at major stops along the route: oysters from the coast, alpine cheeses from Switzerland, fresh vegetables from the Italian countryside. A typical dinner might begin with caviar and blinis, followed by a rich consommé, a main course of roasted pheasant or fillet of beef, and concluding with an elaborate dessert like a mousse au chocolat or a delicate pastry. Each course was paired with fine wines selected from the train's extensive cellar, creating a culinary journey that mirrored the physical one across the continent. The train also featured a dedicated bar car, a haven of dark wood, worn leather, and hushed conversations. This was the train's nerve center after dark, where secrets were whispered and alliances were forged over cocktails and fine cigars. It was here that the train's reputation for intrigue was truly born. Businessmen made deals that could shape economies, diplomats exchanged sensitive information, and spies, both real and imagined, watched each other over the rims of their glasses. The barman, a model of discretion and professionalism, knew the preferred drink of every regular and was privy to more secrets than any spy master in Europe. It was a place of smoke-filled camaraderie and quiet observation, the social engine of this rolling microcosm of society. The journey itself was a masterclass in logistics, a carefully choreographed ballet of engineering and international cooperation. Crossing a dozen borders meant dealing with a dozen different sets of regulations, languages, and currencies. Yet, for the passenger, the experience was seamless. The genius of Nagelmacher's company, the Compagnie Internationale des Wagons Lits, was in handling all the complex bureaucracy behind the scenes. Passports were discreetly handled by the conductor, customs officials would board and perform their duties with minimal disruption, and the train would glide from one country to the next. This effortless passage was perhaps the greatest luxury of all, creating the illusion of a borderless Europe, united by the singular purpose of elegant travel. The route was a character in itself, a grand tour of the changing landscapes and cultures of the continent. Leaving the familiar elegance of Paris behind, the train would steam through the rolling champagne country of France, its windows framing idyllic vineyards and charming villages. As night fell, it would cross into Germany, passengers waking to the sight of the misty Rhine Valley or the dense forests of Bavaria. Then came the majestic splendor of the Austrian Alps, their snow-capped peaks a breathtaking backdrop for breakfast in the dining car. The journey was a visual feast, a constantly shifting panorama that was as much a part of the experience as the luxury within the train's carriages. Imagine you are there, not as a king or a courtier, but as an ordinary person. The air in your small London neighborhood is thick with the smell of coal smoke, damp wool, and the river. And beneath it all, there's a current of fear. Continuing eastward, the train would descend from the mountains into the grand imperial cities of Vienna and Budapest. Here, the train would pause, allowing some passengers to disembark and new ones to board, bringing with them the distinct atmosphere of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The architecture outside the windows shifted from quaint chalets to grand Baroque palaces. The journey then pushed further, into the Balkans, a region that felt wilder, more mysterious to the Western European traveler. The train would snake through the rugged landscapes of Serbia and Bulgaria, crossing dramatic mountain passes and rumbling over ancient stone bridges, inching ever closer to the edge of Europe and the gateway to the Orient. The final leg of the journey was the most evocative. After crossing Bulgaria, the train would arrive in what was then Constantinople, the fabled city where East met West. The sight of the city's skyline, a breathtaking silhouette of domes and minarets against the morning sun, was the grand prize at the end of the three-day journey. Stepping off the train at Circeii Station was like stepping into another world. The air was filled with the scent of spices and the sea, the sound of the call to prayer mingling with the clamor of the city's busy markets. The Orient Express had delivered on its promise, not just transporting its passengers, but translating them from one reality to another. The golden age of the Orient Express is generally considered to be the 1920s and 1930s, the period between the two world wars. In this era, the train became the preferred mode of transport for the rich, the famous, and the powerful. It was a rolling who's who of international society. You might find yourself sharing the dining car with royalty, like King Ferdinand of Bulgaria, a famous opera singer, a Hollywood movie star seeking anonymity, or a wealthy industrialist. The train was a neutral ground, a place where people of immense influence coexisted for a few days, creating an atmosphere of concentrated glamour and importance. It was the place to see and be seen, a mobile theater of the European elite. Of course, one cannot speak of the Orient Express without mentioning its most famous fictional passenger Hercule Poirot and his creator, Agatha Christie. A frequent traveler on the train herself, Christie was captivated by its unique atmosphere of enforced intimacy and exotic destinations. In 1931, a real-life event where her train was trapped by a blizzard for over 24 hours provided the direct inspiration for her most famous novel, Murder on the Orient Express. Her story so perfectly captured the train's mystique, the eclectic mix of passengers, the claustrophobic luxury, the potential for secrets and dark deeds, that fiction and reality became forever intertwined. The Orient Express became synonymous with elegant mystery. The train's association with espionage was not merely the stuff of fiction. In an age of empires and shifting alliances, the Orient Express was a very real corridor for spies, diplomats, and military attachés. Its route connected key European capitals, making it a convenient and relatively discreet way to travel and exchange information. Secret agents from Britain's MI6, France's Deuxième Bureau, and Germany's Abwehr were all known to be frequent passengers. The closed, intimate environment was perfect for surveillance, for passing messages, or for chance encounters that were anything but. The bar car in particular was a hotbed of quiet observation, where a seemingly innocent conversation could be a matter of national security. The train played its part in major historical events. It was in a carriage of the Compagnie Internationale des Wagons Lits, specifically dining car 2419D, that the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, ending the First World War. In a twisted act of historical revenge, when France fell in 1940, Adolf Hitler ordered that the exact same carriage be dragged from its museum and used for the signing of the Second Armistice, this time with France's surrender. The carriage, a symbol of both French victory and defeat, was later destroyed by the SS as Allied forces advanced, a final, spiteful act to erase a potent symbol of history. The Second World War marked the beginning of the end for the original Orient Express. The continent was once again torn apart by conflict, and international rail travel became impossible. The elegant blue and gold carriages were requisitioned for military use or hidden away for safekeeping. The seamless, borderless world that the train had created was shattered. When peace returned, Europe was a changed place. The Iron Curtain had descended, slicing the train's traditional route in two and making the journey to Istanbul a bureaucratic nightmare of visas, armed guards, and long, tense delays at fortified borders. The glamour was gone, replaced by suspicion and political division. The rise of air travel was the final nail in the coffin. In the post-war era of speed and efficiency, the idea of spending 3 days on a train, no matter how luxurious, seemed anachronistic. Why meander through the countryside when you could fly over it in a matter of hours? The wealthy and influential, who had once been the train's lifeblood, now took to the skies. The Orient Express became a slower, more complicated, and less prestigious way to travel. The service was gradually cut back. The route shortened, and the magnificent old carriages began to show their age. The legend was fading, becoming a relic of a bygone era. The final, direct Paris to Istanbul service of the original Orient Express ran in May 1977. It was a quiet, unceremonious end for a service that had begun with such fanfare nearly a century earlier. The remaining passengers were not kings and spies, but students, backpackers, and a few nostalgic travelers hoping to catch one last glimpse of a fading legend. The once gleaming carriages were worn and tired, the service a pale imitation of its former glory. The train that had once defined an era of travel slipped into history, its name living on primarily in books and films, a ghost on the rails of Europe. However, the legend proved too potent to die completely. In the late 1970s, an American entrepreneur named James Sherwood began buying up original 1920s and 30s carriages of the Orient Express at auction. He embarked on a multi-million-dollar restoration project, painstakingly returning these historic artifacts to their former splendor. Craftsmen were brought out of retirement, original blueprints were consulted, and no expense was spared in recreating the authentic experience. In 1982, the Venice Simplon Orient Express was born, a private luxury train that revived the spirit of its predecessor, running a new route from London and Paris to Venice, connecting three of Europe's most romantic cities. In your world, every neighbor is a potential witness, and every church warden a moral accountant. Your life is lived under a kind of celestial surveillance system, where God, the king, and your parish priest are all watching, and your neighbors are watching most closely of all. Today, the legacy of the Orient Express endures as a powerful symbol of a certain kind of travel, one that values the journey over the destination, elegance over speed, and experience over efficiency. It represents a time when travel was an art form, a grand adventure to be savored. The very name still conjures a world of intrigue, luxury, and romance. It's a testament to the power of a single brilliant idea, that a train could be more than just a mode of transport. It could be a destination in itself, a rolling kingdom of impeccable taste, and a timeless legend that continues to capture our collective imagination. And now, let's leave the gilded carriages of Europe behind and travel to a different time and a very different continent. We're heading to the sun-scorched plains of Western Australia in 1932. The world is in the grip of the Great Depression, and for the farmers here, life is a desperate struggle. Many of them are veterans of the First World War, settled onto marginal land with the government's promise of a new life. But they face an enemy they were never trained for. An enemy that is legion, relentless, and utterly indifferent to their plight. An enemy with feathers. This was the stage for one of history's most wonderfully absurd conflicts. The Great Emu War. The antagonists in this strange conflict were an estimated 20,000 emus. Following their usual breeding season, these large, flightless birds began their annual migration from the inland regions towards the coast. Ordinarily, this was just a part of the natural cycle, but the new farmlands, with their cleared areas, reliable water sources, and tempting wheat crops, presented an irresistible opportunity. The emus, described by one observer as having the invulnerability of tanks, descended upon the farms of the Campion district. They flattened crops, broke through fences, and consumed vast quantities of wheat, threatening to undo what little progress the struggling farmers had made. Their sheer numbers turned a nuisance into a full-blown crisis. Desperate, the soldier-settlers appealed to the government for help. In a moment of what must have seemed like decisive action, the Australian Minister for Defence, Sir George Pearce, agreed. He saw a multi-pronged opportunity. It would be good public relations to be seen helping the beleaguered veterans. It would provide live-fire target practice for his machine gunners. And surely, it would be a simple matter to deal with a flock of birds. Consequently, he authorized the deployment of the 7th Heavy Battery of the Royal Australian Artillery. The military was officially going to war with the emus, armed with 2 state-of-the-art Lewis automatic machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. The command of this unusual military operation was given to a Major GPW Meredith. He arrived in the Campion district in early November 1932, along with his 2 gunners and their formidable weaponry. The local farmers were thrilled, eagerly anticipating a swift and decisive victory. The media, too, took an interest, with a Fox movie-tone cinematographer sent along to capture the glorious triumph of man and machine over beast. There was a palpable sense of confidence. After all, what chance did a bunch of flightless birds have against the disciplined firepower of a modern army? The stage was set for a slaughter. History, however, had other plans. The first major engagement took place on November 2nd. The soldiers spotted a flock of about 50 emus and, with the help of local settlers, attempted to herd them into an ambush. The birds, however, proved to be frustratingly poor soldiers. Instead of clustering together into a convenient target, they scattered in all directions as soon as the firing began. The Lewis guns, designed for mowing down ranks of soldiers, were ill-suited for picking off fast-moving, randomly zigzagging targets. The first barrage was a near-total failure, resulting in only a handful of casualties. The remaining emus simply ran off, unbothered, into the bush. A few days later, Major Meredith and his men planned a new ambush near a local dam, where over 1,000 emus had been spotted. This, they thought, would be the decisive battle. They carefully positioned the gun and waited. As the birds approached, the gunners opened fire. But at the crucial moment, the Lewis gun jammed after firing only a dozen rounds. Before they could clear the stoppage, the entire flock had vanished, having sustained maybe a dozen casualties. The emus, it turned out, were not just fast, they were smart. The commanding general of the emu forces, a particularly large black-plumed bird, was observed by Meredith to keep watch while his comrades ate, warning them of any danger. The soldiers quickly learned that the emus were masters of guerrilla warfare. They seemed to have an uncanny ability to absorb bullets without being stopped. Ornithologist D.L. Cervanty would later comment that the machine gunners' dreams of point-blank fire into serried masses of emus were soon dissipated. The emu command had evidently ordered guerrilla tactics. The emus would split into countless small groups, making it impossible for the gunners to focus their fire effectively. Major Meredith himself was forced to concede the birds, surprising military acumen, stating, "If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world." After nearly a week of this frustrating campaign, the results were laughably poor. The official report from the first phase of the operation noted that 500 rounds of ammunition had been fired to kill at most a few hundred emus. Some reports claimed the number was as low as 50. The media, which had arrived expecting to film a triumph, instead reported on a fiasco. News reports, both in Australia and internationally, began to frame the conflict in a comical light. The image of the mighty Australian army being outsmarted by a flock of birds was simply too amusing to ignore. The Great Emu War was becoming a national joke. The public and political reaction was swift. In the Australian House of Representatives, one politician dryly asked if a, quote, medal was to be struck for this war. The mounting public ridicule and the clear lack of results led to a swift withdrawal. On November 8th, less than a week after it began, the military operation was called off. Major Meredith and his men were recalled. The emus had, for all intents and purposes, won the first round. They continued to raid the farms, seemingly unfazed by their brief encounter with modern military hardware. The farmers were left right back where they started, only now their plight was a source of international amusement. Crime for you isn't a distant headline, it's a constant, tangible threat. Not just the grand evils of treason or murder, but the petty sins that could undo a life, stealing a loaf of bread, poaching a rabbit from a lord's land, or speaking ill of the wrong person. However, the farmers' pleas did not cease, and the emu problem only worsened with hotter weather. A little over a week after the withdrawal, Major Meredith was sent back into the field for a second attempt. He had learned from his initial failures and adopted new tactics. The gunners would now attempt to mount their weapons on moving trucks, creating a kind of makeshift light cavalry. This, they hoped, would allow them to keep up with the fleet-footed birds. It was a desperate, innovative, and ultimately doomed strategy. The bumpy terrain made aiming nearly impossible, and one gunner was nearly thrown from the truck during a chaotic chase. The second campaign was more successful than the first, but only marginally so. Over the course of a month, from mid-November to early December, the military claimed to have killed 986 emus with just under 10,000 rounds of ammunition. Major Meredith also claimed that a further 500 birds had died from injuries sustained. While these numbers were an improvement, the cost-benefit analysis was still absurd. It had taken, on average, more than 10 bullets to kill a single emu. The vast majority of the 20,000-strong emu horde remained at large, continuing their campaign of agricultural destruction. The war of attrition was being won by the side with more bodies to spare. By December 1932, it was clear to everyone that the military intervention was a failure. It was expensive, inefficient, and embarrassing. The Minister of Defense quietly declined any further requests for military aid. The Great Emu War was officially over, and the emus were the undisputed victors. The government instead turned to a much older and ultimately more effective system: bounties. A reward was offered for each emu killed, which encouraged the farmers themselves to take up the fight. Over the next few years, this system proved far more successful at controlling the emu population than the deployment of machine guns ever had. The legacy of the Great Emu War is a wonderfully bizarre footnote in military history. It stands as a perfect cautionary tale about the folly of using complex industrial solutions for what is essentially a problem of nature. It's a story of human hubris, a classic case of underestimating an opponent. The Australian Army, which had proven its bravery and resilience on the battlefields of Gallipoli and the Western Front, was defeated not by a human enemy, but by the chaotic, unpredictable, and surprisingly resilient forces of the natural world. The emus didn't win through strength or strategy, but simply by being themselves, fast, durable, and very, very numerous. In the end, the story is more than just a funny anecdote. It highlights the desperation of the farmers during the Great Depression and the often clumsy, reactive nature of government policy. It's a reminder that the most technologically advanced weapon is useless if misapplied. The image of soldiers in trucks, bumping across a field in a futile chase, firing a machine gun at a flock of giant panicked birds, is a perfect metaphor for so many human endeavors that seem perfectly logical on paper but fall apart when they meet the messy, uncooperative reality of the real world. The emus won, and in doing so they taught a valuable lesson, even if nobody was trying to learn it. Now, let us drift away from the sun-baked absurdity of the Australian outback and travel to a realm of ice, silence, and enduring mystery. We turn our attention to the mid-19th century, an era of bold exploration and unshakable imperial confidence. This is the story of two ships, the most advanced of their time, and the 129 men who sailed them into the unknown, never to return. It is the story of the Franklin expedition, a doomed quest for the Northwest Passage that became one of the greatest and most haunting mysteries in the history of exploration, a chilling tale of ambition, disaster, and the unforgiving power of the Arctic. The commander of the expedition was Sir John Franklin, a seasoned but aging Royal Navy officer and Arctic veteran. By 1845, he was 59 years old, a respectable figure who had served as a colonial governor and had survived previous harrowing trips to the polar regions. He was not, perhaps, the most dynamic or innovative choice, but he was seen as a safe pair of hands, a symbol of British naval tradition. He was tasked by the Admiralty with a mission of immense national importance, to finally navigate the last uncharted section of the Northwest Passage, the legendary sea route through the Arctic that had obsessed explorers for centuries. Securing it would be a crowning achievement for the British Empire. To accomplish this feat, Franklin was given command of two of the finest ships in the Royal Navy, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. These were not ordinary vessels. They were bomb vessels, built with incredibly robust hulls designed to withstand the recoil of heavy mortars. This made them uniquely suited for service in the ice. Furthermore, they were extensively refitted for the expedition, becoming the most technologically advanced exploration ships of their day. Their bulls were reinforced with thick iron plates to help them break through ice, and they were equipped with a novel steam engine salvaged from a railway locomotive, which could power a screw propeller and allow them to travel at a stately 4 knots without wind. The preparations were lavish, a testament to the Admiralty's confidence in a swift success. The ships were stocked with provisions for 3 years, including over 136,000 pounds of flour, thousands of gallons of spirits, and most fatefully, more than 8,000 tins of canned food. This canned food was a relatively new technology, seen as a miraculous way to preserve food and prevent scurvy. The contract was awarded to a supplier who filled the order in a hurry, with consequences that would only become clear decades later. The ships also boasted a steam-powered internal heating system and a library of over 1,000 books, ensuring the men would be warm, well-fed, and well-read as they conquered the Arctic. On the morning of May 19, 1845, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror sailed from Greenhithe on the River Thames. It was a scene of great patriotic fervor. Crowds cheered from the banks as the two ships, immaculate in their naval livery, began their long journey north. Aboard were 129 officers and men, hand-picked for their experience and fortitude. They were the best of the best, the pride of the Royal Navy. A sense of optimism and inevitable triumph filled the air. They were sailing not just into the Arctic but into the pages of history, confident that they would return as national heroes. No one could have imagined the grim fate that awaited them in the silent white wilderness. There are no police as we know them. If you're accused, the local parish constable, likely a baker or a blacksmith taking his turn in the role, comes for you. He is your neighbor, and he is the long, clumsy arm of the law. The expedition made good time across the Atlantic. In early July 1845, they reached the Whalefish Islands off the coast of Greenland, their last stop in the civilized world. Here, they took on fresh meat and water, and the men wrote their final letters home. These letters are filled with high spirits and confidence. They speak of the good food, the strong ships, and the eagerness to get on with the real work of exploration. 5 men who were deemed unfit were sent home on a transport ship, a routine decision that would inadvertently save their lives. In late July, the 2 ships were last seen by a pair of whaling vessels in northern Baffin Bay, waiting for favorable ice conditions to enter the labyrinth of islands that formed the Northwest Passage. Then they vanished. For 2 years there was silence. This was not initially a cause for alarm. The expedition was provisioned for 3 years, and it was understood that they could be trapped in the ice for long periods, unable to send messages. But as 1847 turned into 1848, a gnawing anxiety began to grow back in Britain. The Admiralty, prodded by Franklin's fiercely determined wife, Lady Jane Franklin, began to organize the first of what would become a massive, multi-decade search effort. What followed was one of the largest rescue operations in history, a testament to both Victorian determination and the profound mystery of the expedition's disappearance. Lady Jane Franklin became the driving force behind the search. A formidable and intelligent woman, she refused to let her husband's expedition be forgotten. She relentlessly lobbied the government, funded private search missions with her own money, and offered substantial rewards for any information. Her tireless campaigning captured the public's imagination, turning the search for Franklin into a national obsession. Dozens of ships, from both Britain and the United States, sailed into the Arctic over the next decade, searching for any sign of Erebus and terror. In a great historical irony, these search parties ended up mapping more of the Canadian Arctic than Franklin's expedition ever could have. The first breakthrough came in 1850, when searchers found the expedition's first winter camp on Beechy Island. It was an eerie and desolate scene. They found a scattering of abandoned equipment, including stacks of empty food tins, remnants of a small workshop, and most chillingly, the graves of 3 crewmen who had died during the winter of 1845 to 46. The graves were neatly arranged, marked with wooden headboards. But there was no note, no message left in a cairn, no indication of where the ships had gone next or what their plans were. It was as if they had simply packed up and sailed away, leaving only their dead behind. The mystery deepened. The most crucial, and at the time most controversial, clues came from the local Inuit people. Explorer John Ray, while surveying for the Hudson's Bay Company in 1854, met a group of Inuit who had stories to tell. They spoke of seeing a group of about 40 starving white men dragging a boat south over the ice a few years earlier. The men were thin, desperate, and had bought some seal meat from the Inuit hunters. Later, the Inuit found the frozen bodies of these men, and the stories they told were horrific. They described scenes of mutilation and clear evidence of cannibalism among the desperate survivors. They also sold Ray several silver spoons and other items that were unmistakably from the Franklin expedition. When Ray's report reached Britain, it caused a public scandal. The idea that British Royal Navy seamen would resort to the last dread alternative of cannibalism was unthinkable to the Victorian public. It was seen as an insult to the memory of the heroic explorers. Lady Franklin, along with prominent figures like Charles Dickens, publicly attacked Ray and dismissed the Inuit testimony as the lies of unreliable savages. The establishment preferred to believe in a narrative of heroic suffering and noble death, not one of grim, desperate survival. The crucial clues provided by the Inuit were largely ignored, delaying the discovery of the truth for decades. A few years later, in 1859, a search party led by Francis McClintock, funded by Lady Franklin herself, found the final piece of written evidence. On King William Island, exactly where the Inuit stories had pointed, they discovered a stone cairn containing a single handwritten note. It was a standard Admiralty form with 2 messages written in the margins. The first, dated May 1847, was cheerful. It stated that all well, and that the ships had wintered at Beechy Island and were now beset in the ice off the coast of King William Island. But the second message, written a year later in April 1848, was a litany of disaster. It reported that the ships had been trapped in the ice for a year and a half. Sir John Franklin had died in June 1847. A total of 24 officers and men were dead. The 105 survivors, under the command of Captain Crozier, had abandoned the ships and were setting out to walk overland to the Back's Fish River, hundreds of miles to the south. It was a death march. The note confirmed the Inuit testimony and painted a grim picture of the expedition's end. The ships, so technologically advanced, had become helpless ice-bound prisons. The men, weakened by hunger and illness, made a desperate gamble to walk to safety, a journey for which they were completely unprepared. McClintock's party also found skeletons along the route south, some found in a ship's boat that had been mounted on a heavy sledge, a futile attempt to drag it across the unforgiving landscape. The boat contained an absurd collection of items: silver cutlery, books, silk handkerchiefs, things that were useless for survival but represented the civilized world they were so desperate to cling to. For over a century, that was where the story ended. The ships themselves remained lost, their final resting places a mystery. The why of the disaster was debated endlessly. Why did so many men die so quickly? Why did they abandon the relative safety of the ships for a hopeless trek on land? Modern science began to provide some answers. In the 1980s, a team of scientists led by Dr. Owen Beatty exhumed the 3 bodies from the graves on Beechey Island. The remarkable preservation of the bodies in the permafrost allowed for autopsies. The findings were shocking. Analysis of hair and tissue samples revealed incredibly high concentrations of lead. The source of the lead was almost certainly the thousands of tins of canned food. The cans had been sealed with thick lead solder, and it appeared that this had leached into the food, slowly poisoning the men over a period of 2 years. Lead poisoning would explain so much of the mystery. Its symptoms include physical weakness, confusion, paranoia, and a profound inability to make sound decisions. The men were not just starving, they were likely suffering from severe neurological damage. This would explain the strange decision to abandon the ships and the bizarre choice to haul heavy, useless items across the tundra. Their minds were failing them, just as their bodies were. Let's say you're accused of theft. You're brought before the justice of the peace, a local gentleman of good standing. There's no lawyer to speak for you. It is your word against your accusers, and your standing in the community is your only real defense. The final chapters of the Franklin mystery have been written only in the last decade. Guided by a combination of modern sonar technology and a renewed respect for historical Inuit oral testimony, Canadian search teams made incredible discoveries. In 2014, they found the wreck of HMS Erebus, lying in shallow water, remarkably intact. 2 years later, in 2016, a tip from an Inuit ranger led them to the discovery of HMS Terror, in even better condition, resting peacefully on the seabed in a location aptly named Terror Bay. The ships had been found almost 170 years after they had vanished from the world. The discovery of the ships has opened a new window into the final days of the expedition. Remotely operated vehicles have explored the wrecks, finding them to be astonishing time capsules. Plates are still stacked in shelves, scientific instruments lie ready for use, and the cabins of the officers look as though they were only recently vacated. The location of the ships, far south of where they were abandoned, suggests that some of the crew may have remanned one or both of the vessels after the ice finally released them, attempting a final, desperate sail to safety before ultimately succumbing. The full story is still being pieced together from these silent, underwater witnesses. The story of the Franklin expedition remains one of history's most compelling tragedies. It is a story about the clash between imperial ambition and the raw, untamable power of nature. It's a testament to the limits of technology and a stark reminder that even the most confident and well-prepared plans can be undone by unforeseen circumstances. A poorly soldered can, an unusually cold winter, a patch of unyielding ice. It is also a story of incredible human endurance, both in the doomed efforts of the crew to survive and in the relentless, century-and-a-half-long search for answers, a search driven by love, national pride, and the fundamental human need to know what happened. Now let us move from the frozen north back to the more temperate climes of England, but to an earlier time of great upheaval and change. We are in the 16th century, a period defined by the larger-than-life figure of King Henry VIII and his tumultuous quest for a male heir. This quest would not only reshape the royal family, but would also shatter the religious foundations of the nation. At the heart of this revolution was an institution that had stood for 1,000 years, the monastery. The dissolution of the monasteries was a swift, brutal, and calculated act of state power that would forever alter the landscape, economy, and soul of England. Before Henry VIII's reforms, England was a devoutly Catholic nation, and monasteries were an integral part of its fabric. There were over 800 religious houses, ranging from vast, wealthy abbeys like Glastonbury and St. Albans to small, secluded priories. They were not just places of prayer. They were the nation's primary source of social welfare, acting as hospitals for the sick, shelters for the poor, and inns for travelers. They were also centers of learning and art, preserving ancient manuscripts and commissioning beautiful works of architecture and sculpture. Their influence was immense, and their land holdings were vast, controlling perhaps a quarter of all the cultivated land in England. The catalyst for their destruction was Henry VIII's great matter, his desperate need to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, who had failed to produce a male heir. When the Pope refused to grant the annulment, Henry, guided by his ambitious and reform-minded chief minister Thomas Cromwell, took a radical step. He broke with the authority of Rome, declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, and set the nation on a Protestant course. This break gave Henry the power he needed for his annulment, but it also presented a tantalizing opportunity. The monasteries were immensely wealthy, and, crucially, their allegiance was to the Pope in Rome, making them a potential source of opposition to his new regime. Thomas Cromwell, a man of formidable intellect and ruthless efficiency, was the architect of the dissolution. In 1535, he initiated a massive survey of all the church property in England, known as the Valor Ecclesiasticus, or Value of the Church. This was, in essence, a comprehensive financial audit designed to reveal the full extent of the monastery's wealth. At the same time, he dispatched commissioners to visit every religious house in the country. Their official purpose was to investigate the moral and spiritual state of the monks and nuns, but their true mission was to find or invent evidence of corruption, decadence, and sin that could be used to justify their closure. The reports that came back from Cromwell's commissioners, compiled in a document known as the, quote, Comperta Monastica, were a scandalous litany of alleged wrongdoings. They were filled with lurid tales of monks breaking their vows of chastity, of nuns bearing children, and of abbots hoarding wealth and living in luxury while neglecting their spiritual duties. While there was certainly some truth to some of the claims, any large, centuries-old institution is bound to have its share of corruption. The reports were heavily exaggerated and often fabricated. They were a work of political propaganda, carefully crafted to paint the monasteries as morally bankrupt institutions that were ripe for suppression. Armed with this evidence, Cromwell went to Parliament. In 1536, an act was passed for the dissolution of the smaller monasteries, those with an annual income of less than £200. The official justification was that these smaller houses were dens of iniquity, and that the monks and nuns would be better off being transferred to the larger, more honorable institutions. This was, of course, a thinly veiled deception. It was the first step in a carefully planned process. The Crown's agents moved swiftly, stripping the smaller houses of their valuables: lead from the roofs, bells from the towers, gold and silver plate from the altars, and evicting the residents. The closure of the monasteries was not a popular move, especially in the more conservative and devout northern parts of England. The common people felt the loss keenly. They had lost the source of charity, medical care, and spiritual comfort that had been a constant in their lives for generations. In the autumn of 1536, this resentment exploded into a massive popular uprising known as the Pilgrimage of Grace. Tens of thousands of people, from commoners to gentry, marched under the banner of the 5 Wounds of Christ, demanding a halt to the dissolution and a return to the old religion. It was the most serious threat to Henry's rule he would ever face, but there are strange loopholes. One of the most peculiar was the benefit of the clergy. In theory, it meant clergymen could be tried in more lenient church courts. In practice, it became a get-out-of-jail-free card for anyone who could read. Henry's response to the Pilgrimage of Grace was a mixture of deception and brutality. He initially negotiated with the leaders, making vague promises of pardon and of addressing their grievances in a new parliament. But once the rebels had dispersed, he unleashed his vengeance. The leaders were rounded up, tried for treason, and executed in the most gruesome ways. The uprising was ruthlessly crushed, and it served as a chilling warning to anyone who would dare to oppose the king's will. It also provided Henry and Cromwell with the perfect excuse to proceed with the second phase of their plan. The second wave of dissolutions began in 1538, this time targeting the larger and wealthier abbeys and priories. There was no pretense of a parliamentary act this time. The abbots of these great houses were persuaded to surrender their monasteries voluntarily through a campaign of intense pressure, threats, and intimidation. Those who resisted, like the elderly and revered abbots of Glastonbury, Reading, and Colchester, were accused of treason, put through sham trials, and publicly hanged, drawn, and quartered. Their horrific deaths sent a clear message: resistance was futile. One by one, the great monastic houses of England fell silent. The sheer scale of the destruction was staggering. Once a monastery was surrendered, the king's men would descend upon it like vultures. The lead was stripped from the roofs and melted down. Priceless stained glass windows were smashed, and the buildings were systematically dismantled, leaving them as the hollow, skeletal ruins we see scattered across the English countryside today. The monastic libraries, repositories of centuries of learning, were broken up and their contents scattered. Countless irreplaceable manuscripts and illuminated books were lost forever, sold for scrap, or used as wrapping paper. It was an act of cultural vandalism on a monumental scale. The economic and social consequences of the dissolution were profound. The vast wealth that had been concentrated in the hands of the church was now transferred to the crown. Henry VIII became fantastically, unimaginably rich overnight. However, much of this wealth was quickly squandered on extravagant court life and costly, largely pointless wars with France and Scotland. The monastic lands were sold off, often at bargain prices, to the nobility and the rising merchant classes. This created a new class of wealthy landowners who had a vested interest in supporting the new religious settlement, as a return to Catholicism would mean they would have to give their new lands back. For the ordinary people, the impact was devastating. The social safety net provided by the monasteries was gone. The poor and sick no longer had a place to turn for help. The number of beggars and vagrants on the roads increased dramatically, leading to the creation of harsh new poor laws to deal with the problem. Thousands of people who had been employed by the monasteries, servants, farmers, craftsmen, were now out of work. The dissolution created a social crisis that would take generations to resolve, fundamentally reshaping the relationship between the state, the church, and the people. By 1540, the process was complete. Over 800 religious houses had been closed, over 10,000 monks, nuns, and friars had been pensioned off or turned out, and an entire way of life that had defined medieval England had been erased. The dissolution of the monasteries was a pivotal moment in English history. It was a brutal, cynical act of state-sponsored plunder, but it was also a catalyst for immense change. It secured the English Reformation, centralized power in the hands of the monarch, and created the economic and social conditions that would eventually give rise to a new, more secular and commercially minded England. The silent ruins are a lasting monument to this turbulent and transformative period. Now let us journey to a different empire, one of stunning artistic achievement and profound philosophical depth, located in the heart of Southeast Asia. We are going to explore the magnificent and mysterious city of Angkor, the capital of the once mighty Khmer Empire. For centuries, this sprawling complex of stone temples and vast reservoirs was the center of a sophisticated civilization. Then, it was largely abandoned, swallowed by the jungle, and lost to the outside world for hundreds of years. The story of Angkor is a tale of divine kings, incredible engineering, and the eventual, quiet decline of one of the world's most spectacular ancient cities. The Khmer Empire flourished from the 9th to the 15th centuries in what is now modern-day Cambodia. At its peak, it was the dominant power in Southeast Asia, its influence stretching across Thailand, Laos, and southern Vietnam. The source of its power was a mastery of water management. The kings of Angkor built a vast and complex network of canals, reservoirs, known as barrays, and moats. This sophisticated irrigation system allowed them to harvest rice multiple times a year, creating a massive agricultural surplus that could support a huge population, a large standing army, and most importantly, the enormous labor force required to build their monumental temples. The heart of the empire was the city of Angkor. This was not a city in the modern sense, with dense housing and commercial streets. Instead, it was a sprawling, low-density urban complex covering an area larger than modern-day Paris. The vast majority of the population, including the kings themselves, lived in wooden structures that have long since rotted away in the tropical climate. What remains today, what we think of as Angkor, are the religious monuments. These were built of stone and brick because they were considered the homes of the gods, designed to last for eternity, while the palaces and homes of mere mortals were ephemeral. Central to Khmer culture was the concept of the Devaraja, or God King. Each king was seen as a living manifestation of a Hindu deity, usually Shiva or Vishnu. To legitimize their rule and honor their patron god, each king embarked on a massive building program, constructing a state temple that would serve as his personal monument and the spiritual center of the kingdom. These temples were not places for public congregation, but were microcosms of the Hindu universe. The central tower represented Mount Meru, the mythical home of the gods, and the surrounding moats symbolized the cosmic ocean. To build a grander temple than your predecessor was to assert your own power and piety. To prove your clerical status, you were asked to read a passage from the Bible, typically Psalm chapter 51. This became known as the neck verse, because successfully reading it could quite literally save your neck from the noose. Literacy was a superpower. The most famous and breathtaking of these temples is Angkor Wat. Built in the early 12th century by King Suryavarman II, it is the largest religious monument in the world. It is a masterpiece of symmetry, proportion, and artistic detail. Dedicated to the god Vishnu, it is oriented to the west, a unique feature that has led some scholars to believe it was also intended as the king's funerary temple. Its 5 iconic towers, shaped like lotus buds, rise majestically from the center of 3 concentric galleries. The sheer scale is almost incomprehensible. It was constructed from an estimated 5 to 10 million sandstone blocks, many of which were quarried over 25 miles away and floated down the river on rafts. What truly sets Angkor Wat apart is the quality and extent of its bas-relief carvings. The walls of its outer gallery are covered with nearly half a mile of intricate carvings, depicting scenes from Hindu mythology and historical events from the reign of Suryavarman II. There are epic battles from the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, celestial dancers known as apsaras, and a vast, detailed depiction of the Hindu vision of heaven and hell. These carvings provide an invaluable window into the beliefs, culture, and daily life of the Khmer people. They are a stone encyclopedia of an entire civilization, executed with a level of artistry that is simply staggering. Another key site within the Angkor complex is the walled city of Angkor Thom, built by the great King Jayavarman VII in the late 12th century. After the previous capital was sacked by a rival kingdom, Jayavarman VII built Angkor Thom as a new, fortified capital. At its exact center stands the enigmatic and mesmerizing Bayon Temple. Unlike the classical symmetry of Angkor Wat, the Bayon is a chaotic and complex collection of 54 towers, each adorned with 4 giant, smiling stone faces. It's believed these serene, mysterious faces are representations of the king himself, in the guise of a bodhisattva, a compassionate Buddhist figure, looking out in all directions over his kingdom. The shift from Hinduism to Buddhism under Jayavarman VII marked a significant change in the empire. While earlier kings had focused on personal deification through Hindu gods, Jayavarman VII presented himself as a compassionate Buddhist ruler, dedicated to the welfare of his people. He embarked on a massive public works program, building not only the Bayon but also numerous other temples, as well as a network of hospitals and rest houses along the empire's roads. His reign represents the peak of Khmer power and territorial expansion, but this frantic period of construction may also have placed an immense strain on the empire's resources, possibly planting the seeds of its later decline. The decline of the Khmer Empire and the abandonment of Angkor in the 15th century is a complex issue with no single simple answer. It was likely a combination of several factors. The rising power of neighboring kingdoms, particularly the Thai kingdom of Ayutthaya, led to repeated invasions and the sacking of Angkor. There is also evidence of environmental problems. The massive water management system, the source of Angkor's strength, may have become too complex to manage and prone to failure. Decades of deforestation to fuel the construction projects and feed the population could have led to soil erosion and disruption of the delicate hydrological cycle. Another significant factor was a shift in religion and trade. The state-sponsored Mahayana Buddhism of Jayavarman VII was eventually replaced by the more individualistic and less hierarchical Theravada Buddhism, which did not require the building of massive state temples to a god king. This eroded the ideological foundation of the empire. At the same time, maritime trade routes were becoming more important, shifting economic power away from inland agrarian empires like the Khmer and towards coastal trading ports. Sometime in the 15th century, the Khmer court relocated south, closer to the modern-day capital of Phnom Penh, leaving the great city of Angkor to the jungle. For nearly 400 years, Angkor was reclaimed by nature. The jungle grew over and through the stone temples, with giant silk cotton and strangler fig trees sending their massive roots down through walls and over galleries. While it was never truly lost to the local Khmer people who still revered the site, it vanished from the consciousness of the wider world. It was only in the mid-19th century that French explorers and missionaries, particularly Henri Mouhot, brought the wonders of Angkor to the attention of the West. Their astonished accounts and detailed drawings sparked a worldwide fascination with the lost city in the jungle. The Temple of Ta Prohm is perhaps the most famous example of this union of nature and architecture. It was deliberately left by early 20th century French conservationists in much the same condition as it was found, as a concession to the romantic lost city ideal. Here, the power of the jungle is on full display. Massive tree roots snake over intricately carved doorways, pry apart sandstone blocks, and cascade down walls in a slow-motion embrace of stone. It's a powerful and poetic reminder of the impermanence of human achievement and the relentless, patient power of nature to reclaim what has been abandoned. Today, Angkor is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and one of the most important archaeological sites in the world. The work of restoring and preserving these magnificent structures is a massive, ongoing international effort. Modern technologies like LiDAR have allowed archaeologists to map the full extent of the ancient city, revealing that it was even more vast and complex than previously imagined. The study of Angkor continues to provide new insights into urbanism, engineering, and the rise and fall of civilizations. It stands as a profound testament to the heights of human creativity and a sobering reminder of the complex forces that can bring even the mightiest empires to an end. Now let us leave the jungles of Cambodia and travel across the globe to the bustling, innovative world of late 19th century America. We are going to explore the life of a man whose name became synonymous with a product, a visionary entrepreneur who didn't just sell a camera, but sold the very idea of photography to the masses. This is the story of George Eastman, the founder of Kodak, a relentless innovator and marketing genius who took photography out of the hands of professional chemists and put it into the hands of ordinary people, forever changing how we capture and remember our lives.